Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Get ready, because I've got some chilling stories lined up for you. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying the atmosphere here, hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel would really mean a lot. Thank you. Now settle in, get cozy, and let's get started. The Cradle, a small light boat made of birchwood, rocked gently in the corner of the small house. It was in the shaky, untrustworthy light from the fireplace. Ilera and Thomas had waited many years, hoping silently and praying desperately under the cold Scandinavian moon to finally have a child. And now in the cradle, wrapped in thin white cloth like mist, lay their new baby, a daughter named Agnes. They called her their miracle. But even then, Ilera had a small doubt in her heart. Agnes was a miracle of stillness, a baby that was strangely quiet and calm. She hardly ever cried or even moved, happy to lie still with her dark eyes wide open and not blinking, watching the world with a deep, old look that seemed impossible for someone so new to it. Ilera loved her baby very much, so much it almost felt desperate. At first, she held on to this strange quietness as a good thing. After weeks of sleepless nights with imagined cries and worrying, the quiet, strange peace in their home with baby Agnes felt like a lucky, undeserved gift. But as the days passed and turned into longer weeks, a small worry, cold and constant, started to creep into Ilera's happiness. It was a nagging feeling she couldn't quite explain or ignore. It was in the tiny, almost unseen details that didn't seem quite right, that whisper of something very wrong and scary. Agnes was strong, unbelievably and strangely strong for a baby only weeks old. When her tiny hand closed around Ilera's finger, it squeezed with surprising strength, a grip that felt less like a baby's touch and more like roots holding onto a stone. She seemed to lift her head very easily, her neck muscles looking strong and developed in a way that wasn't natural. And her eyes, those dark, deep eyes like pools of night, they seemed to follow Ilera's every move with a steady look, a knowing, calculating gaze that felt impossibly old for a baby, older than Ilera herself, maybe even older than time. Then there were her needs, the strange hungers that worried Ilera. Agnes nursed with a strong, desperate need that never seemed to be satisfied, like she wasn't human. She drank all of Ilera's milk, leaving her weak and shaking, but Agnes still seemed hungry. Her small body was strangely thin, almost shriveled under her soft baby clothes. Not at all like a plump baby. And it wasn't just milk she seemed to want to eat quickly. Ilera noticed with growing fear that Agnes's head would turn suddenly toward the door. Her nose would widen like a hunting animal's when Thomas, tired and not suspecting anything, brought in firewood from the dark forest. A strange, animal hunger would twist her tiny face, a deep craving in her unblinking eyes as she seemed to smell the damp earth, rotting leaves, and mold in the wood, a hunger for something wild, something unclean, something completely different from a human child. One evening, as Ilera, her hand shaking, was changing Agnes by the dim light of the fireplace, she saw it clearly, undeniably, a detail that broke her last with denial, a horror that froze her blood. A sick color around Agnes's tiny fingernails, a faint, greenish tint under her delicate skin, a color that seemed to glow a little, like moss in a dark cave. Ilera tried to ignore it first, thinking it was just a trick of the firelight, something she imagined because she was tired and scared. But the next day, in the bright light of morning, it was still there, clearly visible, making fun of her denial. And it seemed to get darker, slowly but surely, day by day, a creeping green color spreading across her baby skin, a sign of the wild, a mark of another world. Ilera's worry grew into a deep, icy fear, a basic terror that whispered in the quiet of the night. She told her mother, old Marin, a woman who knew the old ways, the village stories about shadows, the secret whispers of the unseen world that existed beside, below, and inside their own fragile world. Marin listened very still, her eyebrows furrowed like deep graves, her eyes, the color of old stone, becoming more and more serious and knowing as Alara, her voice shaking, told her about Agnes's strange stillness, her unbelievable strength, her monstrous hunger, and the sick green color on her baby's skin. When Alara finally stopped talking, Marin stayed still for a long, heavy moment, staring into the flickering, untrustworthy flames of the fireplace. Her face looked old and worried, marked with the knowledge of forgotten horrors. Then, slowly and reluctantly, she turned to Alara, her gaze heavy like a burial cloth, her voice low and hushed with centuries of fear, almost a whisper from a grave. "Alara," she breathed. The name sounded like a cold breath of fear. Have you thought about the old stories? The whispers in the dark." Alara's blood turned cold in her veins. The old stories. Forbidden tales whispered only in the darkest parts of winter nights. Tales of the hidden folk, the creatures of the wild woods who lived in the breathing earth in the unseen shadows, who were jealous of the warmth of human homes and the sweet innocence of human children, who wanted what they could never truly have. Tales of changelings, of stolen children, of fairy babies left in cradles as cruel, silent jokes on human life. "No, Mother," Alara choked out, her denial sounding desperate, her voice broken by fear. "Don't say it out loud. It can't be. Not Agnes. She's just a quiet baby. Maybe tired, not feeling well." But even as the empty words left her mouth, doubt bit at her like sharp teeth, a cold, creeping certainty that Marin's unspoken, old fear was closer to the truth than she dared to admit. Marin sighed, a sound like wind blowing through a graveyard, her gaze steady and accusing in its knowingness. The marks are on her. The signs can't be denied. The strange stillness, the inhuman strength, the monstrous hunger, and the green, Alara, always the green. The hidden folk are creatures born of the earth, fed by the green woods, tied to the wild. Their children, their replacements, they carry the mark of the wild in their skin, in their blood, in their unholy stillness. She reached out, her hand twisted and cold like winter branches, shaking a little as she gripped Alara's arm with surprising strength, her touch like ice going through skin. There are ways to know, old ways, forbidden tests, whispers from the old beliefs, ways to be sure, and ways to get back what is rightfully yours, if what I fear is true, if the unthinkable has happened. Fear grabbed at Alara's heart, tearing her fragile hope, ripping through her desperate denial, fighting with a small bit of disbelief, a last part of her motherly instinct screaming against the impossible. Could it really be true? Could her sweet Agnes, the child she had carried, nursed, and given birth to, truly be not hers? Gone, replaced in the cradle by something unclean, something from another world, something coldly pretending to be human, something wild, unnatural, a hidden folk child? The thought was monstrous, disgusting, terrifying, yet the unsettling details, the creeping worry, the basic wrongness she had felt from the start, the unspoken terror in her heart, they all seemed to come together around Marin's whispered old fear, becoming a cold, undeniable shape in the darkness of her mind, a shape that whispered of stolen children, of cradles made impure, of humanity replaced by something cold and green and completely, terrifyingly different. Marin, her face looking determined, told her about the old ways, forbidden tests, the ancient cures whispered in the fading light of forgotten fireplaces. "Iron," she said, her voice barely loud enough to hear. The hidden folk hated iron. Its cold, pure touch was against their earthbound nature. "Put iron near the cradle," Marin whispered, and a change would show itself, would pull away in strange horror, would reveal its monstrous true form under the fairy disguise. And fire, she breathed, her eyes shining with old knowledge. Fire had a basic power against the creatures of the underworld, a cleansing force that burned away illusions, that showed the truth hidden in shadow. A test of fire, Marin hinted, her voice dropping to a near-silent shake, a moment of controlled, terrifying threat. Might force a changeling to break down, to change back into the stolen human child, or to run away in terror, leaving its stolen appearance and showing the real human daughter hidden, trapped under the unholy fairy disguise. Ilera pulled back from the harsher cures, the forbidden whispers of firelight tests sending shivers of icy horror through her soul. Images of burning babies and strange flames searing her mind. But the iron that she could try that night, under the cold, uncaring gaze of the moon, as Thomas slept soundly beside her, unaware of her growing terror. Ilera crept to the cradle, her hands shaking, numb with dread, as she placed a small, rusty iron nail, cold and heavy like a gravestone, under the edge of the linen blanket, inches from Agnes's impossibly tiny, unnatural hand. She waited, her breath stuck in her throat, trapped in her chest. The flickering firelight cast long, strange shadows that danced and twisted on the cottage walls, making fun of the fragile piece of their home, hinting at the horrors to come. Agnes lay still, strangely so, as always, her dark eyes wide open, not blinking, fixed on the moving, distorted shadows that reached the ceiling above, taking the darkness, reflecting a light inside that wasn't human. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, quietly, almost without being noticed, Agnes moved. Her tiny hand, resting inches from the cold iron, twitched violently. Then, again, a shaking spasm, and again, a frantic trembling that spread through her impossibly small body, a growing restlessness that was completely different from her usual, death-like stillness. Ilera watched, paralyzed by dread, her heart beating like crazy against her ribs, as Agnes's tiny hand started to twist against the soft blanket, jerking violently away from the unholy iron nail, pulling back as if burned by invisible flames, pushed away by an unseen force. A low, almost silent whimper came from Agnes's impossibly small lips, a sound of pure discomfort, agonized restlessness, or something deeper, something older, something completely inhuman struggling against its fragile, stolen human form. The sick greenish color on her nails got stronger, turning into a poisonous jade, seeming to glow faintly in the flickering, deceptive firelight, like rotting plants in a dark swamp. And her eyes, no longer calm pools of darkness, but now focused, narrowed into slits like a predator's, fixed with unholy intensity on the offending iron nail, narrowed, sharpened, burning with sudden, strange, ancient fury, a cold, reptile-like displeasure that chilled Ilera to the core. Ilera, her breath catching in her throat, snatched the tainted iron nail away, her hand shaking violently, numb with icy dread. Agnes stilled instantly, the unnatural restlessness vanishing as if it had never been, her dark eyes returning to their usual, strangely calm, unnervingly knowing gaze, erasing all trace of the monstrous display. But the lasting image of that tiny hand twisting in strange horror from the iron, the subhuman whimper, the flash of ancient, reptile-like fury in those deep eyes, it was burned into Ilera's mind, seared into her soul, an undeniable, horrifying confirmation of her deepest, darkest fear. Her child was gone, vanished, stolen. The thing in the cradle was not Agnes, not human, not hers. The baby in the cradle was a changeling, a fake without a soul, a cruel joke left by the hidden folk, a creature of the underworld, swapped in the dead of night for her real daughter, taken away into the unseen, unholy world under the earth, into the shadow realm beyond the firelight. Despair, black and deep, washed over Ilera, covering her, threatening to drown her in its icy depths. to put out the last bits of hope. But under the suffocating despair, a flicker of something else started. A basic spark of strong, motherly anger. A burning, protective fury that refused to be put out. She would not give up her child. She would not let the hidden folk, these unholy thieves of children, keep what was rightfully hers, what belonged to her blood, her heart, her very soul. She would fight. She would get her daughter back, even from the clutches of the underworld itself. She held on to Marin's words, the forbidden whispers of fire, the ancient, desperate cures. That night, under the cold, uncaring gaze of the fading moon, Ilara, her hands moving with a desperate, feverish energy, built a fire in the fireplace. A fire bigger than any fireplace should hold, hotter than any normal flame. A bonfire of defiance burning within the small cottage walls. The flames roared and crackled with strange hunger, leaping and twisting like tormented spirits, casting, dancing, strange shadows that covered the cottage, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous copies, filling the small space with disturbing, hellish, flickering light that mocked the pale moonlight coming through the window. She lifted Agnes in the cradle, her movements automatic, driven by a desperate, basic will, holding the changeling close to her trembling chest, her heart a battleground of icy fear and strong, desperate, all-consuming love for the stolen daughter she would get back. She stood steady before the roaring, unholy fire, the searing heat burning her face and drying her throat. The flames leaped higher, hungrier, casting strange, long shadows that danced and twisted like tortured souls on the cottage walls, threatening to swallow the fragile human world in their unnatural light. And she spoke, her voice shaking, weak, barely human, yet filled with a desperate, unbreakable determination, talking not to the thing in her arms, but to the unseen, unholy forces that had violated her home and stolen her child. The hidden folk who lurked in the shadows beyond the firelight, listening, waiting, wanting. "Return her," Ilara commanded, the words torn from her throat, echoing the firelit, expectant silence, defiant against the unseen darkness. "Return my daughter now. This is not your place. This is my home. She is my child, born for me, tied to my heart. Take back your replacement, your unholy joke, and give me back my Agnes. Now!" She walked toward the roaring fire, her step steady, unwavering, driven by a desperate, motherly courage, holding the changeling closer and closer to devouring flames. The unbearable heat grew stronger, burning her skin, the flames leaping higher, hungrier, licking at the air around them, casting a searing, blinding, unholy glow that threatened to burn down the small cottage and tear away the veil between worlds. The changeling in her arms stayed still, strangely so, its dark eyes fixed, not blinking, fascinated by the roaring, consuming flames, reflecting the hellish firelight with strange, cold, reptile-like intensity, a knowing gaze that seemed to recognize its true home. But then, so slowly it was almost unnoticed, something began to break down. Something began to fall apart. A violent shaking went through the changeling's impossibly small body, a convulsive shudder that wasn't from cold, but from something inside, something old, something violently rejecting the human form, something breaking down and disappearing. The sick greenish color on its nails burst outwards, turning into a poisonous, glowing jade, spreading like a fast-growing moss up its tiny fingers, eating away its delicate skin, staining its baby flesh with the unholy color of the underworld. Its skin itself seemed to thin until it was almost see-through, becoming almost like smoke, unreal showing faint, root-like veins underneath, glowing with a sick, earthy light, a plant-like glow that made fun of human blood, showing its unholy nature. Its features, once subtly and deceptively human, began to shift and twist, to sharpen into strange angles, to become more angular, more wild, less like a child and more like a creature, more monstrous. And from an impossibly small throat, a sound came out, Not a cry, not a whimper of human sadness, but a low, raspy, inhuman sound, like dry leaves rustling in a graveyard wind, like earth crumbling into a forgotten grave, like old roots tearing free from the damaged soil, a sound of breaking down, of falling apart, of unholy disappearing. The changeling twisted violently in her arms, its small body bending into impossible, unnatural angles, its tiny limbs flailing with inhuman strength, its dark eyes widening in monstrous terror, filled with sudden, deep fear, a desperate, agonizing longing for something elsewhere, something beyond the reach of the cleansing fire, something lost and forever out of reach. The raspy, inhuman sound grew louder, reaching a high, ear-splitting, soul-shattering shriek that tore through the cottage, breaking the peace of the human home, a sound that seemed to rip at the very fabric of reality, a sound that wasn't pain, but falling apart, of disappearing, of a creature being forcibly pulled back to its true, unholy realm, torn from the stolen appearance of humanity. And then, as suddenly and violently as it began, it stopped. The inhuman shrieking vanished, swallowed by a deafening silence. The monstrous twisting stopped, the unnatural movements ending abruptly. The changeling in Alara's arms went limp, lifeless, its body shrinking, dissolving, fading before her very eyes, its unholy form becoming less defined, less real, less there, breaking down back into the unseen world where it came from. The sick greenish color faded back into nothingness. The unnatural, reptile-like light went out in its eyes. The sickly sweet smell of damp earth and mold disappeared from the air, banished by the clean, sharp, cleansing smell of burning birchwood, the pure, defiant smell of human fire. And in Alara's trembling, exhausted arms, where the changeling had been, lay not emptiness, not nothing, but something fragile, something small, something completely and undeniably human. A baby, pale as moonlight, fragile as glass, weak but perfectly formed, but undeniably real, undeniably hers, returned from the shadow realm. Her eyes were closed in peaceful sleep, her limbs relaxed, breathing softly, evenly, peacefully. For the first time since she had been stolen away, since her cradle had been made impure, her daughter, Agnes, her real child, reclaimed, returned. Alara fell to her knees before the dying, flickering fire, sobbing, laughing, weeping tears of pure relief, holding her real child in her aching arms, tears streaming down her face, tears of release, of deep exhaustion, of a strong, overwhelming love reborn from the ashes of terror, brought back from the icy depths of despair. The cottage was completely silent, blessed with fragile, hard-won peace, except for the gentle crackling embers of the cleansing fireplace and the soft, even, human breathing of her reclaimed daughter. The hidden folk were banished, driven back into the shadows. The changeling was unmade, dissolved, erased. Agnes was home, safe, hers. And in the fragile, precious quiet stillness of night, Alara, her voice raw but strong, began to sing, not a tempting lullaby of ancient magic and dark promises, but a simple, human lullaby of unconditional love and triumphant homecoming. A song of warmth and light, a song of a mother's strong, unwavering, unbreakable devotion, a song to soothe her real child back to the normal world, back to herself, back from the unholy shadow realm of the changeling's cradle, back to the fragile, precious safety of human life. Alina, just barely 10 summers old, physically felt the village fear settling like icy stones in her small stomach. It started with hushed, urgent whispers, furtive conversations between worried grown-ups, anxious glances constantly cast towards a menacing darkening woods looming at the edge of their small, isolated village. Livestock mysteriously gone missing. Old man Lars's prized sheep from its secure flock, both of fragile old Marta's beloved goats from their supposedly safe pen. Not taken by ordinary wolves, they whispered fearfully, but vanished, inexplicably erased, as if the hungry earth itself had opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving no trace, no sound, no scent. Then came the unholy noises from the suffocating woods at deep night. Deep, rhythmic, earth-shaking thumping, like colossal giant footsteps approaching, and guttural, monstrous roars that made the village dogs howl in terror, hackles raised, eyes wide with primal dread, and small children whimper uncontrollably, clinging desperately to their frightened parents. The adults spoke of trolls, ancient and hungry, not in the comforting usual playful fireside tales told in the safe light of day, but with a new, sharp, terrifying edge of genuine, bone-deep fear in their hushed voices. "Stay inside, safe after dusk," her mother pleaded, her hands suddenly tight, almost painfully gripping Alina's small, fragile arm. "Never, ever go near the woods at night, especially not now. The trolls are restless, awakened, and hungry." Chilling stories were solemnly told and fearfully retold of trolls becoming bolder, more brazen, undeniably angrier, venturing unerringly closer to the vulnerable village than anyone could properly remember, violating the unspoken pact between humans and the wild. Stories of foolish children who had disobeyed clear warnings, who had recklessly strayed too far into forbidden woods after nightfall, stories that always ended in frightened hushed whispers and fearful averted eyes, leaving unspoken terrors hanging heavy in the air. Fear hung suffocatingly heavy in the village air, thick and cold as winter fog. But for brave, foolish Alina, it was dangerously mixed with a potent, childishly irresistible curiosity, a reckless yearning to know the unknowable. Trolls, were they really truly real? The stories were so vivid, so terrifying, so deeply ingrained in the village soul, but grown-ups also told made-up stories. Maybe it was just to scare naughty children into obediently behaving, but the raw, naked fear in her usually strong mother's eyes that Alina viscerally felt was undeniably, terrifyingly real. And the genuinely missing animals and the unholy noises, those were not stories. One fateful twilight evening, heart pounding with mixture dread and reckless excitement, fueled by a foolish dare from her bolder, equally reckless friend, Kai, and a desperate, childish need to finally, definitively know the terrifying truth, Alina crept silently out of her creaking house. The village was unnervingly hushed, all windows dark and lifeless, all fires banked low, casting only weak flickering shadows. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of frosty pine and damp grave-like earth, a breath of the ancient mountains themselves. Twilight was violently deepening, bruising the sky in unnatural shades of ominous purples and fearful grays, promising a night of ancient terrors. The woods violently loomed at the very edge of the vulnerable village, a suffocating dark, impenetrable silent wall, simultaneously frightening and irresistibly, dangerously fascinating, a forbidden door to a world of ancient shadow. Her small heart violently hammered against her fragile ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the suffocating heavy silence, each pulse echoing the ancient fear of the village, the primal dread of the woods. Every shadow unnervingly seemed to ride with unseen life, to deepen and distort into monstrous shapes. Every rustle of dead leaves unnervingly sounded like approaching, heavy, deliberate footsteps. The silent forest itself seemed to be watching, holding its breath. But she foolishly, bravely pressed on, deeper into forbidden woods, driven by the childish, reckless bravado of the foolish dare and the deeper, more insistent, More dangerous pulled her own insatiable curiosity, a moth drawn to a deadly flame. She found unmistakable signs almost immediately, disturbingly quickly, as if the woods themselves were eager to reveal their ancient secrets, to lure her deeper into their shadowed heart. Monstrous, impossibly huge, muddy footprints violently pressed deep into the soft, virgin earth of the barely visible forest path, far, far too large for any mortal human, unnaturally strangely heavy, as if brutally made by something impossibly dense, something of living stone. Deep, vicious claw marks violently raked deep into the thick, ancient bark of towering pines, unnervingly higher than even the tallest, hungriest bear could ever reach, scars on the flesh of the forest itself, wounds inflicted by ancient malice. A lingering, suffocatingly foul smell clung heavily in the frigid air, like damp, grave-cold earth and something else, something indefinable, something vaguely, disturbingly rotten, stony, the scent of ancient decay and primordial power. And then the oppressive silence, an utterly unnatural, soul-chilling silence in the deepest heart of the woods, far deeper than any she had ever wisely known before. No bird song, no rustling animals, no comforting sound of earthly life, only a suffocating, absolute, predatory stillness, as if the entire forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation, silently, menacingly waiting for her, for the foolish child who dared to trespass. Deeper and deeper into forbidden woods she foolishly crept, the suffocating darkness violently thickening around her fragile form, the oppressive silence brutally pressing in on her small, vulnerable ears, stealing breath, chilling blood, promising nightmare. Then, the terrifying sound reached her ears. Heavy, monstrous footsteps, unmistakable, undeniably real, rhythmic and earth-shaking as a giant's heart beating, violently approaching from the lightless depths of the ancient woods, hunting her with ancient intent. Branches snapped like brittle bones under impossible weight, undergrowth violently crushed and torn, the sounds unnaturally loud, monstrously amplified in the suffocating silence, heralding the arrival of something ancient and evil. Fear, raw and icy as a glacial wind, primal and overwhelming as a collapsing mountain, finally, utterly overwhelmed her fragile childish bravado, extinguishing its fragile flame, leaving only pure, unadulterated terror. She desperately wanted to run, to violently flee back to the fragile safety of the village, to the fading comfort of her warm, distant bed and her protective mother's arms. But dangerous curiosity, that foolish, reckless, childish need to see, to finally know, terrifyingly held her frozen, paralyzed, rooted to the cold, trembling uncontrollably, foolishly hidden behind the thick, ancient trunk of a towering pine, waiting for the nightmare to find her. The footsteps grew closer, louder, heavier, each earth-shattering step vibrating in her very bones, stealing her breath, promising her doom. Shadows unnaturally shifted and writhed between the suffocating trees. Massive, grotesquely distorted shapes slowly moving in the sickly spectral moonlight, barely filtering weakly through the impenetrable canopy. Then, in the moonlit clearing, a terrifying figure finally appeared. It was colossal and grotesque, lumbering into full view. The pale light made its form utterly soul-shatteringly terrifying. A troll, no longer a comforting story, no longer a dismissible whispered legend, but violently, undeniably real, ancient nightmare made flesh and shadow. It was impossibly huge with rough rock-like skin. Its shape was vaguely humanoid but monstrously distorted, almost grotesquely so. Its unnaturally deep-set eyes burned with a cold, spectral inner light in the suffocating darkness. They seemed like windows to an ancient, malevolent soul. It moved with slow, deliberate, earth-shattering power, each monstrous step violently shaking the fragile earth beneath its immense weight, each guttural, unholy breath a deep, resonant rumble that violently echoed through the oppressive silent woods, a promise of pain, a whisper of despair, a harbinger of eternal night. Terror, pure and overwhelming, paralyzed Alina's small body. It shattered her soul, stopping all thought and reason. Her childish bravery vanished, leaving only a primal, animal-like dread. She utterly forgot the foolish dare, completely forgot her pathetic bravado, irrevocably forgot everything but the overwhelming, all-consuming primal need to violently escape, to flee for her life, to outrun the ancient nightmare. She turned and desperately fled, crashing blindly through the suffocating undergrowth, razor-sharp branches violently whipping at her small, exposed face, cruel thorns tearing brutally at her thin clothes, her breath coming in ragged, agonizing gasps, each inhale a fragile victory against encroaching darkness. She ran blindly, mindlessly, driven only by the monstrous, unholy image violently burned into her fragile mind, by the relentless, earth-shattering heavy footsteps pounding monstrously behind her, by the guttural, soul-chilling roars violently echoing to the suffocating trees, hunting her with ancient malice, claiming her for the shadows. She ran, utterly lost and hopeless, not knowing where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away. She desperately needed to escape the ancient troll, the terrifying cursed woods, and frantically return to the fragile safety of her village, back to the life-giving light. And as she desperately ran, a faint, half-remembered whisper from one of the genuinely old, fear-laden fireside tales violently surfaced in her utterly panicked mind. Sunlight, trolls and merciful sunlight. They inescapably turned to inert stone. Merciful dawn. She had to reach the village before dawn. If she didn't, the ancient troll would inevitably catch her fragile body. She also had to escape before the suffocating darkness utterly claimed her small soul. Her desperate flight violently became a life-or-death race against ancient time, a terrified, agonizing dash toward the fragile, distant hope of life-saving sunrise, the only, utterly desperate weapon against the awakened nightmare she had foolishly, recklessly dared to seek in the suffocating, darkening woods, her only chance against eternal night. The wind carried old stories across the open land of the Sami people. It spoke to old Inga, like it always did, in a language older than people, a language of rustling birch trees, of pine trees heavy with snow, of the deep silence of mountains. Inga, her face covered in wrinkles from sun and cold wind, her eyes as clear and blue as melted ice from the mountains, felt the wind's strange worries settle like ice in her bones. Something was terribly changing in the old, sacred way of the land, a wrong feeling she hadn't felt in all her long years of herding reindeer across these mountains. She felt it in the spirit of the land itself, a shaking of deep fear in the ground under her feet. It started slowly, quietly, with the reindeer, the heart of Sami life. Inga's herd, usually calm and almost magically connected to the hidden feelings of the wilderness, became wild and restless. They got scared easily, their dark eyes wide with a deep fear Inga couldn't understand, a fear that spoke of something old and wrong. At night, their sad, desperate cries echoed loudly through the valleys, a heartbreaking sound of pure fear that made it hard to sleep, destroying peace and quiet. Reindeer, who knew the smell of wolves and bears, were reacting to something unseen, something old, something people couldn't understand. Then they started to disappear, to vanish completely, not taken by wolves or bears, not lost in storms, but just gone, as if an invisible hand had lifted them from the earth, stolen by the shadows. Empty patches of snow showed where they had been, as if they had been violently pulled away, leaving no sign, no smell, no struggle, swallowed by the mountain itself, eaten by the ancient darkness. Inga, at first, tried to find normal earthly reasons. Had the wolves found a new way to hunt? Were the reindeer scared by unfamiliar places to eat? But the quiet worry kept going, getting worse and worse with each lost reindeer, each night of sad cries. Then, the stories of the really old legends started coming to her tired mind, unwanted, like shadows from old graves. Stories of Stallo, the big, monstrous, terrifying giant of Sami folklore. Creatures made of stone and shadow, beings from the first earth with old anger, said to sleep in the highest mountains, beings with great, unpredictable power, like forces of nature in giant form. Tales whispered to scare children who didn't listen, yes, but also real old warnings. Warnings carefully passed down through many generations about respecting nature, the delicate balance of life and spirit, the old agreement between people and the land, and the ancient spirits that protected the wild places. Disrespect, going where you shouldn't, upsetting the balance. The old people had always warned, could wake up things that were best left sleeping in the cold, dark heart of the mountains. As the days got shorter and shorter, shadows growing long like reaching claws across the bloody snow, Inga found clear signs that froze her blood and chilled her soul more than any winter wind. Footprints. Huge, unbelievably big footprints in the fresh snow. Too wide, too deep, too heavy for any animal she knew. Strangely heavy, as if pressed down by something incredibly big and not human. Footprints that seemed to appear and disappear for no reason, going against nature, leading nowhere or vanishing into solid rock, as if the mountains had opened up and swallowed them. She found old trees violently pulled up, not by a storm, but twisted and broken like twigs by an unseen giant hand, the ground around them torn up, as if scratched by huge claws, damaged by ancient anger. And then the terrible sounds began. At dusk, as the mountains turned dark purple and black against the dying sky and the valleys filled with shadow, a deep, rumbling roar that shook the earth would echo from the highest mountains, a sound that shook her chest, took her breath away, chilled her soul, a sound that clearly spoke of something huge and old with ancient, strong anger, a sound that promised violence and sadness. And with the roar, a bad, strange smell would drift down from the mountains, a suffocating smell of ice and freshly turned earth, of crushed stone and something old and very unclean, like the mountain itself was waking up. Fear, cold, paralyzing, deep in her soul, went right through Inga's strong herder's heart. This was definitely not a wolf, not a bear, not any normal animal. This was something else, something ancient, something monstrous, something from the oldest Sami stories, something from the really old legends. Stallo, a troll, clearly terrifyingly awakened, definitely violently angry, and clearly threateningly moving downwards, coming down from its ancient home high in the mountains, waking from its long sleep, stirred by something unknown, made angry by some unseen person, coming down with slow, heavy steps towards the lower valleys, towards the villages, towards her people. Panic, sharp and cold as ice, strong and overwhelming like a snowstorm, made her run desperately down the dangerous mountain. She scrambled and slid, not caring about her old, aching joints, driven by a deep life or death need. She had to warn them. The stories, the legends, they said trolls always turn to stone in the light of the sun. That old weakness was definitely their only hope. She had to reach her village before night really fell, before the troll came further down into the valleys, before the darkness gave it unstoppable, ancient power. Inga ran into the village as the last bit of light disappeared from the sky, her breath coming in gasps, her lungs burning, her voice rough and hoarse with desperate urgency. She frantically told him about the restless reindeer, the huge, impossible footprints. the soul-chilling roars from the highest mountains and the big, terrifying shadows she had unwillingly seen moving in the fading light. At first, the younger villagers, influenced by the city, the modern generation who thought the old ways were just silly superstitions, looked at her with disbelief. But Inga's face, worn by a life lived with a harsh land, now showing raw, undeniable fear and ancient, unsettling knowledge, and the deep terror in her cracked voice was impossible to ignore. The elders, their wise eyes holding the same deep understanding of the land's hidden language as Inga's, listened with serious, immediate understanding. They knew the stories. They remembered the chilling warnings. They understood how serious the ancient threat was. As the blood-red moon slowly rose, casting long, thin, strangely shaped shadows across the vulnerable village, quiet fear quickly turned to desperate action. Inga, her voice surprisingly strong again with the authority of age, directed them with clear commands. "Fire!" she ordered, her voice ringing with the wisdom of many generations of Sami people, of old knowledge echoing through time. "Keep the sacred fires burning strongly all through the unholy night. Trolls hate fire, fear its light, and are pushed back by its power. And we must desperately pray to Bivi, to Sunna, the sun goddess who gives life, for a quick return for the safety of her light. We must use the old charms, whisper forgotten spells, beg for protection of the old gods. For when the sun finally rises," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper full of fear, a sound barely heard above the rising wind. "Only then, only if the ancient powers are kind, only if Bivi answers our desperate prayers, will we be even a little bit safe. Only then, if the old stories are true, will the kind stones slowly take back the evil shadow, sending it back to the darkness where it came from." All through the long, terrible night, the village sacred fires burned brightly, casting flickering orange light against the darkness that kept trying to come closer, desperate lights of hope against the ancient night. The villagers huddled together for warmth, for a little comfort, for shared strength, listening to the howling wind, trying to hear any other, more terrifying sound above the crackling flames, the heavy fear of the awakened ancient mountains pressing down on them like a weight, crushing hope, taking away courage, the terrifying weight of the really old stories becoming definitely real, no longer just stories, but chilling things happening right now. They whispered prayers to Bivi, to Sunna, the sun goddess who gives life, begging for a quick and kind dawn, asking for safety from the ancient darkness. And they waited in terrible silence, in deep fear, with Inga, the old elder herder, her face worn and determined, showing fear but also a small spark of old hope, turned firmly toward the east, watching with desperate, strong focus of the first, weak promise of safety, of cleansing light, the light that old stories had the only power to turn evil shadow back to stone, the light that was now definitely their only, desperate hope against the awakened terror of the ancient, unforgiving mountains. Hardvard, a man forged from granite and steel, with hands like rusted iron vices, calloused from decades of brutal wrestling timber, didn't hold an ounce of stock in whining old wives' tales. Folklore, pathetic trolls, whimsical forest spirits, entertaining nonsense for weak-willed, firelit evenings around a tourist campfire, utterly irrelevant to the brutal, harsh realities of profitable mountain logging. His crew, a motley mix of grizzled, cynical veterans and naive, easily spooked greenhorns, were there to efficiently extract valuable timber, to relentlessly meet demanding quotas, to earn a hard-earned paycheck. Certainly not to waste time chasing imaginary shadows or foolishly appease non-existent mythical creatures. Sentimentality was a weakness. Efficiency was king. But the mountain forest, ancient beyond human reckoning, indifferent to human ambition, resistant to human control, patiently seemed to have its own, deeply inconvenient ideas. It started insidiously, almost mockingly subtly, with minor, easily dismissed annoyances. Equipment stubbornly malfunctions. A brand new, top-of-the-line chainsaw contemptuously refusing to start despite all logical troubleshooting. A state-of-the-art skidder supposedly infallible hydraulics mysteriously, infuriatingly failing at the most critical moments. Annoying, irritatingly inefficient, yes, but logically easily explained away as simple wear and tear, random bad luck, negligible statistical anomalies. Then came the minor, yet increasingly disruptive accidents. Nothing legally serious. Thankfully, just enough to significantly disrupt the tightly scheduled work, to unacceptably fray already stretched nerves, to eat into precious profit margins. A thick, reinforced cable snapping with alarming ease. A massive, secured log inexplicably rolling dangerously downhill far too fast, narrowly, infuriatingly missing a negligent worker by mere inches. Carelessness, Hardward growled internally, dismissively, simple lack of basic focus, easily preventable human error. He aggressively pushed his already overworked crew even harder, ruthlessly demanding impossible more efficiency, absolutely zero tolerance for unacceptable daydreaming, unwarranted distractions, or superstitious nonsense. The crew, however, and increasingly worryingly, was growing visibly, palpably uneasy, especially the older, more experienced hands, men who had genuinely spent their entire lives in the unforgiving woods, men who instinctively knew the subtle, unspoken whispers of the ancient forest far better than Hardward's soulless production charts, men who understood the language of the land, a language Hardward had arrogantly ignored. They spoke of Skuksru, the ancient vengeful forest spirit, the silent guardian of the woods, undeniably angered by the brutal, disrespectful deep cuts violently tearing into the ancient, sacred woods, desecrating its ancient heart. They muttered darkly about foolishly disrespecting the old, proven ways, about recklessly waking things that should, by all common sense, be wisely left undisturbed, sleeping in the cold, dark earth. Trolls, some whispered fearfully, glancing nervously at the deepening shadows of the tree-lean, ancient, earthbound trolls, becoming brazenly bolder in these changing, disrespectful times, violently pushing back against the noisy, intrusive intrusion of soulless machines and greedy men, defending their ancient domain with primordial rage. Hardward violently scoffed openly, dismissing their genuine anxieties with aggressive contempt, publicly ridiculing their pathetic fear-mongering, childish superstition pathetically clouding otherwise potentially practical minds. We're professional loggers, not superstitious children, he'd aggressively barked, his voice like cracking ice. Get back to productive work. Now. Efficiency, not fear, was the only language he understood. But the disruptions relentlessly escalated, spiraling violently out of any semblance of control, becoming impossible to rationally ignore, utterly beyond any logical explanation, violently mocking his carefully constructed worldview. Entire, meticulously marked sections of prime forest, precisely designated for maximum yield felling that very week, were found unnervingly, inexplicably clear completely overnight, not efficiently logged, as any human crew would do, but savagely, brutally ravaged, as if by a force of nature unleashed in primordial fury. Trees violently snapped and splintered halfway up their ancient trunks, impossibly twisted into grotesque shapes, desecrated and destroyed with unnatural force. Immensely heavy equipment mysteriously moved from secure, logically chosen locations, brutally dragged through dense undergrowth across impassable terrain, impossibly into deep, inaccessible ravines, violently damaged. Thick, Reinforced metal brutally bent like fragile twigs, vital hydraulic cables cleanly severed as if by monstrous teeth. Engines irrevocably jammed with earth and stone, violated by unseen ancient malice, sabotaged by earthbound rage. The usually stoic, unflappable overnight watchman, a practical, level-headed young Finn known for his unflinching calm, reported trembling, wide-eyed, hearing unmistakable heavy rhythmic thumping sounds violently echoing through the suffocating woods after the fall of darkness, after the ancient night claimed the land, sounds that unerringly vibrated in the very ground beneath his terrified feet, sounds that viscerally made his very blood run icy cold, promising ancient violence, whispering of primordial dread. He categorically refused to ever work the night shift again. No amount of threats or incentives could sway his newfound primal fear. Harvard, his aggressively defended pragmatism violently strained to its breaking point. Finally, unwillingly could no longer pathetically dismiss it all as mere coincidence. Simple accidents, easily explained equipment failures, or pathetic overactive imaginations of weak-minded men. Something ancient, something undeniably powerful, something profoundly wrong was violently happening in the deep heart of the ancient woods. Something terrifyingly beyond the mundane, normal disruptions of predictable nature or understandable equipment failure. Something that defied all logic, all reason, all human control. Driven by a desperate need to reassert control, to regain his shattered sense of order, to find a rational, earthly explanation for the unexplainable. He stubbornly stayed dangerously late one approaching evening, foolishly determined to finally find a logical explanation for the increasingly violent overnight damage, to prove to himself and his increasingly terrified crew that folklore was nothing but childish fantasy. He aggressively patrolled a violently ravaged logging site, his heavy, steel-toed boots crunching ominously on violently broken branches, his powerful flashlight beam aggressively cutting through the rapidly deepening twilight, a fragile human light against encroaching ancient shadow. The air was unnaturally cold, oppressively still, suffocatingly heavy with an unnatural, predatory silence, a silence that promised violence, a stillness that heralded ancient awakening. Then, terrifyingly, he heard it again, the unholy thumping, deep, rhythmic, earth-shattering as a titan's heartbeat, ancient and malevolent as the void before creation, violently approaching from the lightless depths of the ancient woods, hunting him with primordial intent, claiming him for the darkness. Categorically not machinery, definitively not animal, unquestionably something else, something ancient, something monstrous, something from the deepest shadows of forgotten lore, something earthbound and terrifyingly real, something unerringly heavy, something deliberately purposeful, something undeniably intelligent, something anciently malevolent. Fear, icy, primal, unwelcome as the grave itself, a cold hand clenching violently around his heart, stealing his breath, chilling his soul, brutally tightened with every relentlessly approaching thump. He foolishly moved directly toward the terrifying sound, not out of genuine bravery, but out of the stubborn, almost suicidal need to finally understand, to aggressively control, to desperately find the elusive, desperately needed rational earthly explanation, to cling to the last vestiges of his shattered worldview. He recklessly rounded a sharp bend in the overgrown logging road, his powerful flashlight beam frantically sweeping across the violently ravaged clearing, a fragile human light against encroaching ancient darkness. And there, in the suffocating fading light of dying dusk, he terrifiedly saw it in its monstrous entirety, a colossal, grotesque shadowy figure, unerringly moving amongst the violently felled trees, undeniably, terrifyingly responsible for the utter, inexplicable destruction, impossibly too large for any known bear, ludicrously too heavy for any earthly machine, its monstrous form deliberately indistinct in the suffocating twilight, yet unmistakably colossal, impossibly strong, a being of shadow and stone, Ancient malice given monstrous form. It moved with a slow, deliberate, earth-shattering power, brutally tearing at a massive fallen tree trunk as if it were a brittle twig, effortlessly shattering ancient wood with casual, terrifying strength. Hardvard utterly froze, paralyzed by primal dread, rooted to the spot by ancient fear, his trembling flashlight beam uselessly fixed on the monstrous shadowy shape, a fragile human light against primordial darkness. He viscerally felt a bone-deep, soul-chilling primal chill, a terrifying fear that violently bypassed logic, that unnervingly resonated with something deep and ancient, something forgotten and buried, something primal and undeniable within him, a forgotten ancestral memory of earthbound terror. Then, as he helplessly watched, utterly mesmerized and soul-shatteringly terrified, the first, fragile, pathetically weak rays of merciful dawn, pale and hesitant, barely piercing the suffocating darkness, began to tentatively touch the jagged, unforgiving eastern peaks, a fragile promise of salvation against eternal night. And something ancient, something undeniably magical, something utterly beyond human comprehension, unmistakably began to happen to the monstrous, shadowy figure. It unnervingly seemed to violently stiffen, to petrify before his very eyes. Its deliberate movements became agonizingly sluggish, then unnaturally jerky, then utterly, irrevocably still. The malevolent shadowy form seemed to slowly solidify, to visibly lose its fluidity, to gradually, horrifyingly become inert, lifeless, rock-like, ancient shadow returning to primal stone. As the life-giving sunlight relentlessly strengthened, violently painting the highest mountaintops triumphant gold, the colossal, monstrous figure finally, completely became utterly still, unnervingly silent, menacingly unmoving. It remained there, a silent sentinel of stone and shadow, a monument to ancient power, amongst the violently ravaged trees. No longer a terrifying creature of malevolent shadow and deliberate motion, but a massive, grotesquely, unnaturally shaped tombstone, a silent warning carved in ancient rock. Hardvard's rigidly pragmatic, now irrevocably shattered mind, replacing fear with a cold, calculating realization, the dismissed old stories, the ridiculed whispers of trolls, the laughable weakness to life-giving sunlight. It wasn't pathetic superstition. It was a brutally practical explanation, a coldly logical solution. He unnervingly stared at the now petrified form, no longer terrifying, now just inanimate stone, a resource to be exploited, a problem to be solved. And a new, chillingly pragmatic thought, a ruthlessly efficient logger's thought, coldly calculating, utterly devoid of fear or wonder, began to form in his newly changed mind. Sunrise, the troll's ancient, exploitable weakness. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't merely a costly disruption. Maybe, just maybe, it was a brutal, unconventional tool, a ruthless, undeniably effective way to aggressively control the unacceptable disruptions, to efficiently protect his valuable equipment, to ruthlessly get right back to profitable work, to meet those demanding quotas, to maximize that all-important bottom line. The folklore, the myth, the superstitious nonsense. It wasn't entirely pathetic nonsense after all. It was unexpectedly useful information, potentially brutally useful profit-generating information, a resource to be ruthlessly exploited just like the ancient forest itself. The exhibit halls are not just large, they are vast. They stretch out like cathedrals of silence, Spaces designed for throngs of people, now utterly deserted, echoing chambers where sound itself seems to dissolve and vanish. During the day, they are alive with voices, a constant murmur, a sea of faces moving from display to display, their collective presence filling the immense space, giving a sense of purpose, of life. But at night, the crowds are gone, vanish as if they never existed. The voices are silenced, swallowed by the darkness. The footsteps cease, leaving only the cold, echoing emptiness. In the halls, they transform. They become something cavernous, labyrinthine, infinite, something ancient and still, something listening to the silence itself. I'm on patrol in the East Wing tonight, the largest, most sprawling section of the museum, a seemingly endless maze housing the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, the Gallery of Lost Empires, the Chamber of Forgotten Gods, vast, interconnected spaces, stretching out in a disorienting labyrinth of darkened corridors, towering exhibits that loom like silent monoliths, and echoing chambers that seem to extend into infinity. It takes hours, endless, lonely hours, to complete a full circuit of this wing alone. Hours of walking in profound silence, of checking shadows that seem to deepen and shift with a life of their own, of listening to the amplified echoes of your own breathing in the oppressive emptiness, the only sound in a world of frozen stillness. The silence in the exhibit halls at night is not merely the absence of sound. It is a tangible presence, a thick, heavy blanket woven from shadows and stillness that muffles every sound, absorbs every vibration, amplifies the smallest tremor until it resonates unervingly in the vastness, then swallows it whole, leaving only more silence. Your own footsteps in this oppressive quiet sound strangely loud, intrusive, each footfall echoing sharply off the cold marble floors, bouncing off the towering columns, traveling down the long, empty corridors like a trespasser in a forbidden realm, only to be consumed again by the all-encompassing, watchful silence. It's a silence that feels alive, patient, waiting, as if the museum itself is holding its breath, listening to the darkness, listening for something. I'm deep within the Hall of Ancient Civilizations now. Towering columns, impossibly high, vanish into the unseen darkness above, their shadows stretching across the polished floor like fallen giants, obscuring the path ahead, creating pools of impenetrable blackness. Massive stone carvings, relics of forgotten empires, loom in the dim emergency lighting, their surfaces cold and smooth to the touch, their faces impassive, inscrutable, their empty eyes fixed on some distant, unknowable horizon, some point beyond human reckoning. Glass cases, cold and sterile, gleam faintly in the weak light, reflecting distorted images of the hall back into the darkness, holding within their unyielding confines the silent relics of vanished cultures, objects imbued with untold stories, untold histories, untold presences that linger in the air, unseen, unheard, yet felt. Routine patrol. Check the outer perimeter, scan the silent exhibit cases, ensure no alarms have been triggered, no doors have been inexplicably unlocked by unseen hands, no disturbances have broken the unnatural stillness. Just routine, a ritual performed in the dead of night, in the heart of the sleeping museum. But tonight, the silence feels different, somehow. Heavier, more oppressive, more expectant. The shadows seem to writhe and deepen, not just in the corners of my vision, but directly in front of me, as if the darkness itself is solidifying, taking shape. The air itself feels charged with an unseen energy, a subtle vibration that prickles at my skin, raises the hairs on the back of my neck. Or maybe again, it's just the suffocating late hour, the endless, soul-numbing monotony of the night shift, the way the vast, echoing emptiness of the museum at night can slowly, insidiously, begin to unravel your sanity, to play cruel and elaborate tricks on your mind, to amplify every stray thought, every nascent fear, every flicker of unease until it becomes a roaring certainty. And then in the heart of that oppressive silence, in the vast, echoing emptiness of the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, I hear it, faint, almost subliminal, a whisper against the overwhelming silence, a sound just at the edge of hearing, barely distinguishable from the deep, watchful stillness of the hall, a rhythmic something. Footsteps? No, utterly, demonstrably impossible. I know I am alone here. I checked the security logs with meticulous care just an hour ago, verifying every sensor, every camera, every entry point. No one else in the East Wing. No one else in the entire museum complex, except for me, the security monitors, and the all-consuming silence. It cannot be footsteps. It must not be footsteps. I freeze mid-step, holding my breath until my lungs burn, straining every sense, every nerve ending, listening with an intensity that borders on pain. Silence. Just a vast, echoing, breathing silence of the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating me with its immensity. The faint, almost inaudible creak of the ancient buildings settling deeper into the earth, the distant mechanical hum of the ventilation systems circulating air through the empty halls, the faint, almost spectral whisper of air currents stirring unseen in the immense space. Nothing else. No other sound, just silence, vast, echoing, knowing silence. See? Imagination, a trick of the acoustics, the buildings settling, the wind, the silence itself, playing tricks, the museum at night, finally, inevitably getting to me, cracking the edges of my carefully maintained sanity. I force myself to start walking again, resuming my patrol with deliberate, measured steps, telling myself, commanding myself, that it was nothing, just a phantom of the silence, just a building sigh in the dead of night, just something perfectly, rationally ordinary. But then, undeniably, inescapably, there it is, again, faint, rhythmic, chillingly persistent, undeniably footsteps, echoing softly, rhythmically, from somewhere deeper within the exhibit hall, from somewhere ahead of me, in the impenetrable darkness that pools between the towering exhibits, in the echoing silence that seems to amplify and distort every sound, every sensation. Utterly, demonstrably, logically impossible, still impossible, and yet there it is, real, audible, footsteps, faint, rhythmic, echoing footsteps, in the Hall of Ancient Civilizations, in the vast, deserted East Wing, when I am the only living, breathing soul in the entire museum complex. My heart stutters in my chest, a sudden, erratic beat against my ribs. A cold fist clenches in my stomach, twisting and tightening, stealing my breath. Disbelief wars with primal, instinctive fear that claws at the edges of my reason, that whispers of things unseen, things unheard, things that should not be. I try to tell myself it must be an echo, some bizarre acoustic anomaly, sound traveling in impossible ways through this vast, echoing space, reflecting off the cold marble, bouncing off the impassive stone carvings, creating an elaborate, unsettling illusion of footsteps. That must be it. Acoustics, echoes, illusions of the silence, tricks of the light and shadow, tricks of a tired, overstressed mind. Must be. I force myself to walk on, deliberately louder now, each footfall heavy, forced, trying to consciously amplify my own footsteps, to create a wall of sound, to mask the unsettling rhythm, to drown out the faint echoes, to prove to myself that it's just a trick of my own movements, just a phantom of the silence. My boots clang sharply against the cold marble floor, the sound echoing loudly, almost desperately, through the hall, bouncing off the silent exhibits, shattering the oppressive stillness momentarily. And yes, the faint, rhythmic footsteps ahead, they persist, undiminished, unchanged in pace or rhythm, unmoved by the louder intrusion of my own deliberate footfalls, distinct from my own heavier, more forced movements, coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness ahead. Unmistakably, undeniably footsteps. Someone or something is walking in the hall of ancient civilizations, in the utterly empty museum, in the cold, dead heart of the night. And it is not me. It cannot be me. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck intensifies, spreading like icy tendrils down my spine, raising gooseflesh on my arms, stealing the warmth from my skin, leaving me cold despite the stale, overheated air. The feeling of being watched, of being observed, of being followed returns, amplified, intensified, overwhelming my senses. But this time, it's not just an unseen gaze. It's an audible presence, a sound in the silence, a movement in the stillness, something moving in the impenetrable darkness, in the echoing silence, in the vast, echoing emptiness of the exhibit hall. Something other, something not human, something unwelcome. Who is it? What is it? Is someone actually here, in defiance of all logic, all security, all reason? Has someone, something, bypassed every alarm, every sensor, every locked door, and broken into museum in the dead of night, moving silently through the shadows, unseen, unheard until now? But why? Why break into a museum in the dead of night, only to walk, slowly, deliberately, rhythmically, echoing in the vast silence, announcing their presence with each measured footfall, yet remaining unseen, hidden in the impenetrable darkness? It doesn't make sense. None of it makes any rational, human sense. And the feeling of being utterly, profoundly alone in this vast, echoing space, yet undeniably, terrifyingly not alone. It's growing stronger with every echoing footstep, with every agonizing second that stretches into an eternity of dread. It's not just a sound anymore. It's a violation. A violation of the silence, of the emptiness, of the carefully constructed solitude of the museum night. A deliberate, chilling intrusion into a space that should be utterly, inviolably empty. I have to investigate. I must know. I must find the source of sound. To confront whoever is walking in the hall of ancient civilizations, shattering the silence, violating the emptiness, stealing the solitude of the night. Even though every instinct screams at me to turn back, to retreat, to flee this growing unease, to run from the echoing footsteps and the oppressive silence, duty, training, professional pride, something compels me forward. And something else, darker, more primal, a morbid, terrifying curiosity that overrides all reason, a chilling, irresistible fascination with the unknown, with the unseen, with a source of sound that should not exist, a bone-deep, soul-chilling certainty that whatever is making those footsteps, whatever is walking in the darkness ahead, is waiting to be found, is luring me forward, into the silence, into the shadows, into the heart of the mystery. I force myself to move forward again, each step a monumental effort, slow, agonizingly cautious, my flashlight beam trembling violently in my suddenly numb hand, cutting a weak, inadequate sway through the impenetrable, oppressive darkness. Each footfall feels impossibly heavy, leaden, echoing far too loudly in the suffocating silence, announcing my approach to whatever is waiting in the shadows ahead. The rhythmic footsteps ahead, they continue, unchanged, undiminished, undeterred, unwavering in their slow, deliberate pace. Always the same distance ahead, neither closer nor further, always echoing the vast, echoing emptiness, always leading me deeper into the darkened exhibit hall, deeper into the suffocating silence, deeper into the heart of the encroaching unknown, toward whoever is walking there, in the shadows, in the silence, making those slow, deliberate, impossibly echoing footsteps in the dead of night, in the vast, empty museum. And I know, with a chilling, bone-deep certainty that settles in the marrow of my bones, colder than the marble beneath my feet, more absolute than the suffocating darkness, more final than the echoing silence itself. Whatever is making those footsteps is not human, not anymore, not in this place of shadows and silence, not at this dead hour of the night. And whatever it is waiting for me, patiently, relentlessly, inevitably waiting, in the footsteps, in the silence, in the darkness, in the vast, echoing emptiness of the exhibit hall, waiting, always waiting, just ahead, in the shadows, in the silence, waiting for me. And there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, only to walk forward towards the sound, toward the darkness, towards the footsteps echoing in the silence, waiting. Dr. Lara Hansen was a well-known scholar who didn't easily believe things. She was becoming famous in the serious world of Swedish folklore studies. She stood in the quiet silence of the university's old records room. Dust floated in the weak sunlight that came through the tall, arched windows of the library, making thin shadows across the rows of old books that had become her main interest. Her current research, what she really wanted to achieve, the topic of her next important paper, was about the Mara, also called a nightmare or the riding hag. This was a scary creature in Scandinavian folklore, said to ride on people's chests while they slept, stealing their breath, making them unable to move, and filling them with terror. Ilara believed in reason and facts. She looked at the Mara legend like a doctor examining a patient, ready to take it apart intellectually. She thought it was a strange, old-fashioned cultural thing, left over from a time when people were superstitious and didn't understand science. She saw it as a perfect example of how uneducated societies misunderstood natural things that we now understood through science, like sleep paralysis, night terrors, anxiety, and fear spreading through stories. Her paper was meant to prove that the mare wasn't real, to take apart the idea intellectually, and to explain it scientifically. She wanted to remove the magical feeling around it and show the natural, psychological reasons behind the myth and fear. Her intense research took her to far-off, forgotten villages in the quiet Swedish countryside, places where old traditions still held on strongly. In these isolated communities, whispers of the mare still went around like a cold breeze during the long winter nights by the fire. She talked to old villagers whose faces showed the marks of time and hardship. Their voices were dry like leaves blowing across frozen ground, from old age and the unspoken fear passed down through generations. They told chilling, incomplete stories that had been passed down like a curse, about suddenly waking up unable to move and struggling to breathe, about shadowy figures in the dark, and about horses found in the morning covered in sweat, and with their manes tangled into strange knots, said to be mare-ridden, marked by the night hag's touch. Ilara listened, watched, analyzed, and made notes. She was patient, careful, and scientific. She wrote down their stories with precise detail, nodding as if she were interested, hiding her own doubts with show of scholarly curiosity. But in her mind, she remained firmly detached, not believing in the supernatural. She saw the patterns that made sense, how cultural worries could turn into monster figures, how ideas could spread in isolated communities, and how normal sleep problems could be misunderstood because of fear and lack of knowledge. She carefully wrote down these logical patterns, building a strong argument for a purely natural, psychological explanation. She backed up her scientific view with a lot of information, confident in her modern understanding and the power of reason over superstition. But then, so slowly it was almost unnoticed, like a tiny crack in perfect ice, something started to change within her strong skepticism. As Alara studied the dark, unsettling world of the mare more and more, reading old, disturbing books and feeling the weight of generations of folklore, nightmares, unwanted, scary nightmares, began to creep into her own fragile sleep, disturbing her rational mind. At first, they were quick and easy to ignore, unclear shadows and pressure, blurry figures seen out of the corner of her eye, a brief feeling of heaviness on her chest, a moment of breathlessness that she could easily dismiss. She quickly and logically blamed these on stress, too much work, and the simple fact that she was spending her days reading scary stories, preparing her mind for darkness. But the nightmares continued, coming back regularly and becoming more frequent, more intense, and disturbingly real. The shadowy figures became clearer, sharper, and took on definite, evil forms, appearing unmistakably in her dreams, looming over her with unseen intentions. The heavy feeling on her chest grew stronger, becoming a crushing, unbearable weight that felt like she was suffocating, stealing her breath in her dreams and threatening to end her life within her own mind. The moments of breathlessness turned into agonizing struggles for air, terrifying times of imagined suffocation that left her gasping for breath in her silent dreams, waking up suddenly with her heart pounding, her lungs burning as if with fire, her chest aching with unseen wounds, her body covered in cold sweat, and the lingering feeling of suffocation staying with her like a dark cloud, poisoning her waking moments with constant dread. And the details, the small, terrifying details of her nightly torments, started to match the old chilling folklore stories she was studying with detached academic interest, with disturbing accuracy, making fun of her confident skepticism and weakening her logical defenses. The inability to move, just like the villagers described, trapped her mind inside her body, unable to move, scream, or escape the nightmare, completely vulnerable to the unseen terror. The crushing weight on her chest, stealing her breath, exactly as the old tale said, suffocating her with an invisible evil force, copying the mare's legendary ride. The clear, undeniable feeling of a presence, something not of this world, something evil, something old and hungry watching, waiting, riding her in the suffocating darkness, feeding on her fear and getting stronger from her terror, just like the folklore mare was said to do. Ilara, the strong believer in logic, the fortress of reason, the scholar of unwavering skepticism, fought desperately against a growing worry, violently resisted the creeping, suffocating dread that was taking over her mind, invading her sleep and weakening her carefully built view of the world. She tried harder to find rational explanations, holding on to scientific ideas like a drowning person to a broken piece of wood, insisting to herself with desperate, empty conviction that these were just nightmares caused by stress, meaningless coincidences that echoed the superstitious folklore she was objectively studying, just product of her imagination being overactive from her academic work. She firmly refused to believe any other illogical possibility, desperately clinging to her intellectual skepticism as a weak, crumbling shield against the suffocating darkness that was slowly seeping into her own fragile sleep, poisoning her own rational mind, and threatening to break her strong belief in the power of reason. But one unholy night, under the cold, uncaring gaze of the fading moon, her denial suddenly broke. One terrifying, unforgettable night, the nightmares came together, changed, and became something more, something infinitely more terrifying, something completely and irrevocably monstrous, something that violently shattered the carefully built, intellectually strong walls of her cherished skepticism, something that brutally forced her, against her will, against her reason, against her very nature, to face the unthinkable, illogical, folklore-filled possibility that maybe the old whispers in the darkness were not entirely empty, not entirely meaningless, not entirely false. She woke up in the dead, suffocating stillness of the night, in the absolute silence of her darkened city apartment, violently pulled from the fragile safety of sleep and thrown into a waking nightmare. She was fully aware, agonizingly conscious, her eyes snapped wide open in basic terror, staring blankly into the unyielding darkness of her bedroom ceiling, searching for escape and finding only dread. But she couldn't move, paralyzed, completely, terrifyingly and irreversibly paralyzed. Every muscle in her body was locked, refusing to respond, betraying her will and trapping her mind inside her body. She couldn't twitch a finger, couldn't blink, couldn't even take a shallow breath. Her lungs were screaming for air, her chest tightening as if squeezed by an invisible force, and air itself became something precious and hard to get, each shallow gasp of burning pain. Panic rushed through her like liquid nitrogen, freezing her blood, turning her mind to stone, threatening to break her sanity and drown her in its icy, deep depths. Sleep paralysis. Her rational mind screamed in desperate denial, a known, well-documented neurological thing, a temporary, harmless glitch in the sleep-wake cycle, a perfectly natural, scientifically explainable problem with the brain. It was just sleep paralysis. It was natural, not supernatural. It was explainable, not monstrous. It was harmless, not deadly. But the terror that filled her was deep, basic, undeniable, completely and soul-shatteringly real. And then, in the suffocating silence, in the absolute darkness, she felt it, knew it with a basic certainty that destroyed reason. A presence, a heavy, oppressive, suffocating, evil presence entering her room, forming from the deepest shadows in the corner, becoming solid from the darkness itself, breathing with the rhythm of the earth, filled with ancient anger. Something watching her with unseen eyes, coming towards her was silent, hunting intent, drawn to her paralysis like a vulture to a dying animal, irresistibly attracted to her fear, her vulnerability, her complete helplessness. A cold dread, deeper than any earthly cold, washed over her in a suffocating wave, icy and paralyzing, a basic terror that connected with something old, buried deep within her DNA, something instinctive, pre-human, older than consciousness itself. The shadowy presence moved, gliding across the smooth floorboards of her modern apartment with an impossible, unnerving silence, rippling through the suffocating darkness like ink spreading in water, becoming a vague, monstrously human-like form in the unyielding darkness, a twisted copy of a human shape, changed by shadow and evil. It loomed over her bed, towering above her frozen, defenseless body, blocking out the weak, distant moonlight coming through her city window, plunging her in an absolute, lightless, suffocating shadow, erasing the normal world and leaving only nightmare. She couldn't see it clearly. The darkness was too absolute, too complete, too old. But she felt its weight, its immense, crushing size, its clear, suffocating evil, pressing down on her with unseen force, suffocating her with its very presence, drowning her in ancient, earthbound dread. And then the pressure came down. A crushing, unbearable, agonizing weight became solid on her chest, appearing from the shadowy, monstrous presence looming above, pressing down with the force of collapsing mountain, squeezing her lungs until they were useless, stealing her breath, putting out the fragile flame of life within her body, crushing the air from her desperate lungs, suffocating her with an unseen, unstoppable, ancient force, born of shadow, nightmare, and folklore terror. She struggled, fought with every part of her paralyzed body, to breathe, to scream, to move, to break free from the suffocating paralysis, from the oppressive presence, from the crushing, deadly suffocation. But she was trapped, imprisoned in her own body, completely vulnerable, powerless before the unseen ancient nightmare that was riding her in the suffocating darkness, devouring her soul. This is it, a basic, instinctive voice screamed in the broken pieces of her mind, a voice beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond skepticism, beyond conscious thought, a voice born of ancient fear, echoing from the beginning of humanity. This is the mare. This is not sleep paralysis, not a problem with her brain, not a scientific oddity. This is real, undeniably real, terrifyingly real. This is happening now to me in the darkness, in the silence, in the middle of the modern city. She was being ridden, violated, suffocated, claimed by the ancient monstrous nightmare she had so arrogantly and dismissively rejected as just superstition, by the creature she had intellectually analyzed, academically proven wrong, scientifically explained, by the legend she had tried to rationalize away, to erase from the modern world. Terror, pure, absolute, basic terror, overwhelmed her, destroying the last bits of reason, shattering the fragile remains of skepticism, leaving only raw, instinctive fear, complete and soul-deep helplessness. The crushing, unbearable weight on her chest, the unseen, monstrous presence feeding on her terror in the suffocating darkness, the agonizing, desperate, useless struggle for breath. She fought to scream, to move, to call for help from the silent, uncaring city outside, to break free from the unholy paralysis, from the nightmare presence, from the suffocation that promised oblivion. But she was trapped, imprisoned in the horror of her own terror, completely and irreversibly vulnerable to the ancient, unseen nightmare that was riding her in the suffocating darkness, devouring her very soul. And then, without warning, without explanation, without mercy, just as suddenly, as violently, as terrifyingly as it began, it lifted, vanished, disappeared back into the unyielding darkness. The crushing, agonizing pressure on her chest miraculously vanished. The unholy paralysis disappeared like morning mist. The shadowy, monstrous presence retreated back into the lightless corners of her room, falling apart like a nightmare dissolving in the pale light of dawn, leaving behind only a deafening silence, an oppressive emptiness, and a lingering, icy feeling of deep, unexplainable, undeniable terror. Ilara gasped, violently convulsed, breathing in roughly, desperately sucking life-giving air into her starved, burning lungs, her heart pounding unevenly against her ribs, her body trembling uncontrollably, covered in cold, fear-soaked sweat, her mind reeling, broken, completely and irreversibly shaken. She lay still in the suffocating darkness, trembling uncontrollably from the aftereffects of terror, her breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. Her eyes snapped wide open, widened with lingering, basic terror, staring blankly into the empty, mocking darkness of her modern city bedroom, frantically searching for any sign, any trace, any lingering shadow of the unseen, monstrous presence that had just violated her mind, tormented her body, ridden her soul, suffocated her very being. But there was nothing, only oppressive silence, only suffocating emptiness, only the lingering, icy chill of unexplained, undeniable, deep dread, a phantom weight on her chest, a whisper of suffocation in the still night air. The rational explanations, the scientific theories, the strong fortress of academic detachment, they all seemed suddenly and completely empty, utterly and terrifyingly meaningless, laughably inadequate in the face of the deep, undeniable terror she had just experienced. The clear, soul-chilling feeling of an unseen, monstrous, evil presence, the agonizingly real sensation of supernatural suffocation, the strange and horrifying match with the old, fear-filled folklore description she had, objectively and academically studied for months, dismissed as superstition and categorized as myth. Ilara, the unwavering skeptic, the intellectual debunker, the believer in pure reason, was irreversibly and monstrously awakened, not to complete, unquestioning belief in the literal, folkloric existence of the mare as a real, Supernatural being, not entirely, not yet, but to something infinitely deeper, something profoundly more unsettling, something that violently shattered her cherished academic view of the world, something that brutally forced her to face the uncomfortable, terrifying limits of human reason, the fragile, illusionary nature of intellectual skepticism, the lasting, terrifying power of ancient folklore, and the bone-chilling, soul-shattering possibility that some ancient fears, some whispered legends, might contain a bit of terrifying truth, a shadow of undeniable reality, a whisper of something profoundly unexplained and truly monstrously, terrifyingly unsettling, lurking just beyond the fragile edges of human understanding, just beyond the comforting reach of scientific explanation, waiting in the suffocating darkness, riding the stolen breath of vulnerable sleepers, hungrily feeding on the raw, basic essence of human terror, forever haunting the shadowed corners of the human mind. She continued her research, of course. Now, though, it wasn't just about getting ahead in her career. It was because she had a desperate, unsettling need to understand, to make sense of, to control the nameless terror that had invaded her sleep, hurt her mind, and broken her disbelief. She was a scholar first, always wanted to learn and explain things that didn't make sense. But now, how she approached things was completely different, colored by fear and a new, unwilling respect for the lasting, terrifying power of old stories, for the realness of what people experienced, even if it seemed illogical and scary, for the deep, dark parts of the human mind, and for the lingering, chilling possibility that some mysteries, some nightmares, some old, whispered fears might never be fully explained by reason, might always stay hidden in shadow, ridden by the mare, haunted by the ancient questions that whispered in the suffocating darkness, just out of reach of the weak light of human reason, waiting for the next vulnerable sleeper, hungry for terror, thirsty for souls. Stockholm's hyper-efficient sterile pulse brutally faded behind Johan. With every kilometer, he aggressively drove north, thankfully replaced by the gradual, soul-cleansing encroachment of genuine, untamed wilderness. He believed in clear, logical thinking, like the sharp lines of the city he loved. Now, the city person, who often looked down on anything not urban, was temporarily seeking refuge in the truly wild mountains. It was almost a joke, this escape to nature. He audibly scoffed at the well-meaning, yet pathetically ignorant concerned warnings of the weathered gas station attendant in the last, insignificant village. Stay off the trails after dark, young man. The mountains here aren't friendly to city wanderers at night. Superstition, laughable rural myth. The endearing, quaint anxieties of the uneducated masses. Johan, smirking inwardly, armed with his latest model GPS, his meticulously, flawlessly planned route, and his unshakable, almost religious belief in flawless modern logic, arrogantly knew infinitely better. The hike began precisely, predictably as digitally planned, a small, personal, triumphant assertion of human control over the chaotic unpredictability of the lesser natural world. Sunlight filtered weakly through the impersonal pine canopy, painting fleeting, meaningless shifting patterns on the perfectly, reassuringly well-marked trail. The air was acceptably clean, tolerably bracing, a minor, temporary welcome contrast to the stale, recycled air of his hermetically sealed, climate-controlled city apartment. Johan moved with confident, almost aggressive strides, his overpriced hiking boots crunching with satisfying precision on the perfectly predictable, utterly mundane path. His state-of-the-art modern backpack, a self-affirming symbol of his unquestionable mastery over the easily conquered wilderness. He paused condescendingly only to briefly consult his GPS, graphically reaffirming his unerringly precise location, his inevitable, flawlessly linear progress. Folklore? Myths? He was effortlessly navigating by military-grade satellite for God's sake. Savages used folklore. Civilized men used technology. But the mountains were ancient, beyond what humans could truly understand. They were patient, beyond what people could imagine, and didn't care about human arrogance. Slowly, inevitably, and effectively, they had their own way of quietly weakening fragile human confidence. Johann, utterly absorbed in the metronomic, self-important rhythmic crunch of his boots and the smugly self-congratulatory monologue playing endlessly in his overly confident head, foolishly misjudged the almost imperceptible shift of the unforgiving sun. He pushed aggressively further than wisely planned, stubbornly determined to reach a specifically digitally marked vista point on a sterile digital map, willfully ignoring the insidious creeping lengthening of shadows, the subtle yet undeniable deepening of the forest's unnerving predatory silence. By the time he reached the vista, breathless, sweating and vaguely disoriented, yet still outwardly triumphant, the sun was already bleeding crimson toward the horizon. Dusk was not approaching. Dusk was already here, a suffocating blanket of encroaching shadow. Panic, cold and unwelcome as a physical blow, a jarring, illogical anomaly in his perfectly ordered world, pricked sharply, insistently at the fragile edges of Johann's carefully constructed, aggressively defended rationality. He consulted his GPS again, frantically, his fingers fumbling with the cold, unresponsive screen. The return route, smugly clearly marked in unforgiving daylight, now seemed menacingly indistinct, disturbingly unreliable in the rapidly fading light. He walked faster, trying to look confident even though he was scared. He foolishly forced a fake confidence into his hurried steps. Desperately, he told himself, though he didn't really believe it, that the fading light was just playing tricks on his eyes, which relied too much on seeing clearly. But the trail itself seemed to deliberately twist and turn in impossible, mocking illogical ways, violating all digital mapping, all human reason. The once reassuringly familiar markers suddenly vanished as if by ancient magic, erased by unseen hands. The once predictable, easily conquered forest now violently pressing around him, suffocatingly close, unnervingly silent, undeniably watchful, imbued with a predatory sentience he could no longer deny. Unsettling sensations began to insidiously creep into Johann's rigidly, defensively logical mind, violating its sterile order, poisoning its fragile confidence. A constant, icy prickling sense of being intensely deliberately watched from the suffocating, all-consuming deepening shadows, a visceral, undeniable feeling of unseen ancient eyes relentlessly following his every increasingly panicked step, judging his soul, claiming his being. Strange echoes in the suddenly, unnaturally cold valleys, disembodied sound that mockingly mimicked heavy footsteps directly behind him. Too rhythmic, too heavy, too deliberate to be natural animal, too close, too insistent, too intelligent, too knowing to be mere wind. Rock formations, smugly once familiar landmarks in the reassuringly bright sunlight, now violently loomed in the suffocating unnatural fading light, shifting and distorting into grotesque, undeniably humanoid shapes, silent, watchful sentinels of stone and shadow, ancient guardians of the mountain's dark heart, playing terrifying, soul-shattering tricks on his strained, desperate, increasingly unreliable eyes, mocking his modern senses, shattering his urban confidence. He pathetically tried to rationalize it all away. Simple fatigue, easily explained low blood sugar, the predictable tricks of shadow and deceptive perspective, the understandable anxieties of the city mind in the unfamiliar wilderness. But a cold, Ancient seed of genuine, paralyzing fear had been violently planted, insidiously taking root in the fertile, yet ultimately fragile ground of his naive urban skepticism, poisoning his blood, chilling his soul, promising a descent into nightmare. Darkness fell with terrifying speed, faster than natural. It felt like a living thing, a hunter, violently taking over the last bits of fading light. The once familiar forest was completely swallowed by a suffocating, ancient blackness that nothing could penetrate. Johann was now truly and completely lost. He was undeniably and deeply afraid, utterly and pathetically alone. He stumbled blindly and desperately through the trees, his GPS signal flickering on and off, unreliable. It was a cruel joke, this useless technology against the ancient, untamed wilderness, like a fragile toy against immense power. He violently heard distinct, undeniable, monstrously heavy footsteps approaching rapidly from the darkness behind, relentlessly closing in, hunting him with ancient, patient intent, breaking branches with unnatural, earth-shattering force, crushing undergrowth with impossible, bone-jarring weight, guttural growls, deep and resonant as the earth's own tortured breathing, ancient and malevolent as the void before creation, echoed unnaturally loudly through the suffocating trees. Clearly, terrifyingly not from any known earthly animal. Panic violently exploded in Johann's chest, shattering the last, fragile remnants of his naive urban arrogance, extinguishing the last spark of his pathetic confidence, leaving only raw, primal, soul-shattering terror. He tripped violently, falling heavily, agonizingly against a cold, unyielding, tombstone-like rock face, the unforgiving mountain itself rejecting him, casting him out into the darkness. And there, just a few terrifying meters away in the pitch-black darkness, in the deep shadows, he unwillingly saw it. A cave entrance, yawning blackly, monstrously wide in the solid, unyielding rock, a gaping maw in the earth itself, a gateway to the underworld, a portal to ancient nightmare, emitting a strange, earthy, almost fungal, undeniably grave-like smell, a stagnant, suffocating odor of damp stone, ancient decay and something else, something indefinable, something profoundly unclean, something evil. An unnatural, bone-deep chill radiated viscerally from its utterly lightless depths, a cold that violently seeped into Johann's fragile bones, deep in the mountain night. Colder than death itself, a premonition of the grave, seeking desperate, foolish shelter from the rapidly approaching, undeniably terrifying sounds. Johann crawled unwillingly into cave, blindly, pathetically hoping for fragile refuge, foolishly, tragically seeking safety in the very heart of the ancient darkness, willingly entering the monster's lair. He fumbled frantically for his useless headlamp, its weak, pathetic beam barely, inadequately piercing the suffocating, absolute blackness of the ancient cave, a fragile candle against primordial night. Then, the weak, flickering light revealed the creature. He truly saw its monstrous form, and the terrifying reality of it hit him deeply, shaking his soul. There was no denying what he saw. The cave was not empty. It never had been. A massive creature, impossibly huge and monstrously shadowy, completely filled a small, cramped space. It was so large it seemed to dwarf the cave itself. This colossal, grotesque form slowly and deliberately took shape from the darkest shadows clinging to the ancient cave walls. Rough tombstone-like rock skin unerringly glimmered faintly, menacingly in the weak, pathetic lamplight, reflecting the fragile human light with cold, ancient malice. 2 points of cold, spectral, unholy light, unmistakable predatory eyes, burning with an unnatural internal fire, a light born of shadow and ancient magic, a gaze older than time itself, unwaveringly fixed on Johann with ancient predatory hunger, judging his soul, claiming his being, promising eternal torment. The terrible smell of wet dirt and crushed bloody stone got much stronger very quickly. It became completely suffocating, like there was no air left. It felt like the mountain itself was breathing out something evil. Then a low, deep growl that shook the ground rumbled through the small cave. It vibrated in Johann's body, making him feel weak and promising pain and death. Urban skepticism, modern rationality, technological confidence, all violently shattered, all utterly meaningless, all tragically, pathetically useless, fragile toys against ancient, earthbound power in the suffocating darkness of the troll's ancient lair. Troll, the chilling, undeniable word violently exploded in Johann's shattered mind. Stripped bare of all irony, all disbelief, all arrogant urban confidence, reduced to its primal, terrifying essence. Ancient nightmare made flesh and shadow. Folklore, myth, superstition. They were real, terrifyingly and undeniably so. They were ancient truths whispered by the wind, warnings that had been foolishly ignored. Now, brutally and completely, their reality was confirmed. Johann was completely paralyzed by overwhelming fear that shook his soul. He could only stare, frozen and helpless, at the huge, ancient creature looming over him in the pitch-black darkness of the troll's cave. He felt like a rabbit caught by a snake. But in the broken pieces of his once logical mind, a single, desperate thought appeared weakly. It was a last bit of hope, a half-forgotten warning from the gas station worker that he had ignored. He faintly remembered a childhood story about folklore, sunlight, trolls and sunlight, an ancient weakness, turning to stone, merciful dawn, impossible survival. This was his only hope. Even though it seemed absurd and ridiculous, he was relying entirely on the very myths he had arrogantly and foolishly dismissed, on the ancient magic he had condescendingly denied. His only chance was to somehow survive the endless, terrifying night, to desperately hold on to life until the first rays of life-giving dawn finally broke through the darkness. He hoped that the cleansing light would violently turn the evil shadow back into harmless stone, that the sun, the ancient enemy of shadow, would win over the night. He hoped that the myths he had laughed would become his only desperate, impossible way to survive until morning. Elias sought the forest for silence, but the silence of these ancient Swedish woods was not entirely peaceful. It was a silence thick with unspoken things, a silence that felt less like solace and more like waiting. He sought the solace of trees older than memory, but these trees had witnessed centuries of decay and rebirth, of hidden processes unfolding in the darkness, and their silence held the weight of that ancient, indifferent knowledge. He sought the quietude that cities could never offer, but this forest offered quietude of a different kind, a stillness that felt aware, expectant, almost predatory. It was late October. The birches stood skeletal against the pewter sky, their leaves long surrendered to the wind and the damp earth. Pines, stoic and dark green, dominated the landscape, their needles carpeting the forest floor in a thick, springy layer that muffled every footstep. The air was cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and decaying leaves and the pervasive, earthy aroma of damp soil and something else, something fungal. The forest floor was a tapestry of mushrooms, crimson caps pushing through the leaf litter, pale toadstools clinging to rotting logs, bracket fungi like shells on ancient tree trunks, and something else, something unseen, something stirring beneath the leaves, a hidden network you could almost feel vibrating beneath your feet, a silent, unseen pulse. Fungi thrived in this damp, decaying world, unseen networks spreading beneath the surface, a hidden kingdom pulsing with unseen life. Elias, usually attuned to the subtle language of the woods, barely noticed them, preoccupied with his own weary thoughts. He hiked deeper, following a barely discernible trail that wound through the dense woods, further and further from any sign of human presence. The forest grew quieter, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy in fractured shafts, painting the undergrowth in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The wind whispered secrets through the pines, secrets in a language older than words, secrets that spoke of cycles of decay and rebirth, of hidden processes unfolding beneath the surface of the visible world. And there was a scent, a pervasive, underlying scent that mingled with the damp earth and pine needles, a musky, earthy aroma, rich and fertile, but also unsettling. Something wrong, something that didn't belong in the clean, natural scent of the forest. Something wilder than any animal, yes, but also tainted, unclean, ancient. Something musky, but not like animal musk, not like deer or bear or fox. Something off, something that prickles at my senses and raises the hairs on my arms. Something unnatural. He veered off the trail, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, pushing through a thicket of ferns into a small, hidden hollow. The air here was noticeably colder, damper, heavier, and the fungal scent was overpowering, almost cloying, a sickly, sweet, decaying aroma that clung to back your throat and made your stomach churn, a scent that felt wrong, unnatural, almost tainted. Before him, nestled in a shallow depression in the earth, was a grotto, not a deep cave, more like a scooped-out hollow beneath a tangle of exposed tree roots and moss-draped rocks. But it was what grew within the grotto that caught his breath. Fungi, an impossible profusion of fungi, more than he had ever seen in one place. They carpeted the grotto floor, clung to the damp rock walls, sprouted from the exposed roots like grotesque ornaments. They were every shape, size, and color imaginable, luminous white clusters like frozen coral, fleshy crimson shells, bulbous purple forms that pulse with faint, internal light, delicate, lace-like structures of impossible fragility, and thick, core-like strands that snaked across the earth like living veins. And the smell, it was intoxicating, overwhelming, rich, earthy, musky, but with an undercurrent of something sickly sweet, something decaying, something almost carnal, a tainted fertility that both drew you in and repelled you in the same breath. Spores hung heavy in the air, a visible mist in the damp stillness of the grotto, catching the fractured sunlight in shimmering motes. He stepped closer, drawn by a morbid fascination, a reckless curiosity overriding his nascent unease. He wanted to see them up close, to touch them, to understand this impossible fungal garden. He leaned into the grotto, inhaling deeply, drawn in by the overwhelming scent, by the strange, hypnotic beauty of the fungal bloom. And as he breathed, as he filled his lungs with the damp, spore-laden air, he felt a subtle, almost imperceptible tickle in his throat, a faint, earthy taste on his tongue, a fleeting sensation like something settling deep within him. He didn't know it then, but in that breath, in that moment of reckless curiosity, he had crossed the threshold. He had taken in not just air, but a seed of something ancient, something alien, something that would soon take root and bloom within him, twisting his body, consuming his mind, transforming him into something other. He had inhaled the spores of the mycelial veil. The day after, Elias felt off, a lingering fatigue, easily dismissed as hiking weariness. 2 days later, the fatigue was heavier, more persistent, and a dull headache had settled behind his eyes. By the 3rd day, the metallic taste appeared, fleeting but unsettling, and his dreams began, vivid, strange, easily forgotten upon waking, but leaving a residue of unease, a sense of something wrong lingering in his mind. It was subtle, insidious, a creeping unease rather than a sudden assault. But with each passing day, the symptoms intensified, The unease deepened in the forest in his memory began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a source. Days later, back in his isolated cabin at the edge of the forest, Elias began to feel truly unwell. A persistent fatigue clung to him like a shroud, heavier than any post-hike weariness he had ever known, dragging at his limbs, clouding his mind. Headaches throbbed behind his eyes, dull and insistent, a constant, low-level agony. He noticed a strange metallic taste in his mouth, lingering even after meals, a taste that seemed to deepen with each passing day, becoming almost earthy, like soil and decay. In his dreams they became vivid, unsettling, no longer easily forgotten, but haunting his waking hours, filled with increasingly disturbing images of twisting fungal networks, of tendrils reaching through dark earth, of vast, silent intelligences pulsing beneath the forest floor, of eyes opening within the mushrooms, watching him from the darkness. He dismissed these symptoms less easily now, the rationalizations wearing thin, the whispers of unease growing louder, more insistent. He was a man of reason, after all, a man who trusted in logic and dismissed the whispers of unease as mere fancy. But even reason began to falter in the face of this creeping, inexplicable illness. But the symptoms persisted, intensified relentlessly. Muscle twitches began, no longer subtle, but sharp, involuntary spasms in his limbs that startled him awake at night, leaving him trembling and breathless. His skin became strangely sensitive, prickling and itching for no apparent reason, an almost unbearable crawling sensation beneath the surface. He developed cravings for unusual foods, raw mushrooms he found in the increasingly shadowed corners of the forest, decaying fruit he'd normally avoid with disgust, a strange, almost desperate hunger for earthy, damp flavors, for the taste of soil and decay and the musky sweetness of the fungal bloom. His behavior shifted subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, then more noticeably, alarmingly. He became more withdrawn, more profoundly solitary, neglecting even basic self-care, spending hours staring blankly into the darkening woods, listening to the wind whisper secrets through the pines, feeling an inexplicable pull, a yearning that resonated deep within his bones, a primal urge to return to the depths of the forest, to the damp earth, to the fungal darkness. He neglected his usual routines, forgot appointments, lost track of time in a haze of fatigue, disorientation, and a growing, nameless dread. One evening, staring at his reflection in the cabin window, the flickering lamplight casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like living things across his gaunt face, he saw it undeniably, horrifyingly. Not just the deepening fatigue etched in stark lines around his hollow eyes, not just the unnatural pallor of his skin, but something else, something growing. A subtle change in the complexion, a faint, almost imperceptible mottling, a pale, web-like pattern spreading beneath the surface of his skin, visible now even in the dim light, like mycelium taking root beneath his flesh. He lifted a trembling hand to his face, his fingers tracing the strange, branching texture. Skin that felt strangely cool to the touch, colder than normal, disturbingly smooth, almost waxy, like the cap of a pale mushroom. And the fungal scent, faint before, now emanated from him, from his very skin, a sickly sweet, decaying aroma that clung to his nostrils and made his stomach churn. A cold dread washed over him, not just a feeling, but a physical sensation, like icy water flooding his veins, a chilling certainty that something was profoundly, irrevocably wrong, that he was no longer just unwell but infected, violated, consumed from within. He was losing control, not just of his body, but of his very self. His body was changing, yes, but it was more than mere physical illness. It was a transformation, and not in a natural way, not in any way human. The transformation accelerated with terrifying speed after that night. The muscle twitches intensified into violent, convulsive spasms, contorted his limbs in unnatural, grotesque angles, throwing him from his bed, leaving him gasping and trembling on the floor. Fungal growths began to erupt on his skin with horrifying rapidity. Small, pale bumps blossoming into fleshy protrusions in hours, then larger, bulbous masses. Clusters of white and gray tissue pushing through his pores, branching and spreading like grotesque, living ornaments, like parasitic blooms erupting from his flesh. His skin texture changed completely, dramatically, becoming pale, clammy, almost translucent in places, stretched thin over the burgeoning fungal structures beneath, revealing the web-like network of mycelium spreading beneath like a living roadmap of his destruction. His human features seemed to blur and distort, melting away like wax in a fire, his eyes becoming strangely vacant, milky, unfocused, his mouth twisting into a slack, unresponsive shape, his jaw lengthening, his teeth sharpening, his face contorting into something other. His movements became jerky, puppet-like, limbs flailing, gait stumbling, coordination failing completely. His body no longer obeying commands of his fading will, but twitching and jerking to the dictates of something alien growing within. His mind fractured into shards, his thoughts fragmented and incoherent, his memories dissolving like smoke, his very sense of self eroding, fading, dying. Moments of lucidity became rarer, weaker, more fleeting, like sparks in a gathering darkness. Brief flashes of screaming horror as he recognized the monstrous. Fungal parody his body become, as he glimpses reflection in a darkened window, a distorted, fungal thing staring back with vacant, inhuman eyes, a grotesque mockery of the man he once was. But these moments of awareness were quickly extinguished, swallowed by the rising, all-consuming tide of fungal dominance, by the alien will that now pulsed within him, driving him, controlling him, erasing him. He felt himself being overwritten, his consciousness fading into a distant echo, his identity dissolving into fungal network, replaced by something cold, something alien, something mycelial, something ancient and hungry and wrong. The burning sensation, that initial point of contact, that first seed of infection in his hand, intensified, became all-consuming, radiating outwards, no longer just pain but transformation, unnatural metamorphosis. Spreading up his arm like wildfire under his skin, a searing, throbbing agony that felt like molten metal in his veins, like bone and muscle and flesh itself was rearranging itself from the inside out in a way that was fundamentally, horrifically wrong, tainted by something unclean, something inhuman, something ancient. His skin crawled with frantic, internal itching, a desperate, futile urge to tear himself open, to shed this human form that was suddenly, violently, irrevocably becoming something else, something monstrous, something not me, something of the mycelial veil, something of the fungus. His senses exploded, not with natural sharpness, but with distortion, with corruption, with the taint of something unnatural, something otherworldly. Sharpened, yes, but beyond sharpness, into a painful, overwhelming distortion that felt inhuman, bestial, wrong, tainted. Smells became overpowering, overwhelmingly, nauseatingly, sickeningly sweet and decaying. The fungal musk now a cloying, inescapable stench that seemed to emanate from within him, from his very pores, a constant, suffocating reminder of the fungal takeover, of the alien presence blooming within his flesh. Sounds grated on his raw nerves. Every rustle of leaves outside the cabin, every snap of twig underfoot, every creak of the wooden structure amplified into a deafening, agonizing cacophony, a relentless assault on his fractured senses. Sight blurred and warped, the familiar world around him twisting into grotesque, fungal shapes, colors shifting into unnatural, sickly hues, shadows deepening into hungry, living voids that seemed to watch him, to wait for him, to claim him. He was no longer Elias, not in any meaningful sense. The fungus had taken complete root, had spread its unseen tendrils through every fiber of his being, had claimed him utterly as a vessel, a host, a tool, a mere component in its ancient, relentless life cycle. His human will was extinguished, his consciousness a fading ember, replaced entirely by a primal, fungal imperative to propagate, to spread, to bloom, to consume and transform. Driven by this alien purpose, Elias, or the fungal thing that now wore his shape, stumbled out of the cabin, back into the darkening, indifferent forest. He moved with a jerky, unnatural, fungal gait, his body contorted into grotesque shapes. Fungal growths erupting from his skin in pulsating waves, spores dusting the chilling air around him with every labored, rasping breath. He was drawn deeper and deeper into the woods, towards the dampest, darkest, most fertile places, towards the silent, unseen heart of the fungal network that now pulsed within him. As him was him. He climbed, driven by an instinct not his own, an ancient fungal compulsion, his fungal twisted limbs finding unnatural purchase on the rough, cold bark of ancient, indifferent trees, ascending relentlessly towards a darkening canopy, towards a fading, dying light of the autumn sky. He sought height, elevation, a vantage point, not for human vision, but for fungal dispersal, to release his burden, to cast his fungal seed upon the wind, to spread the infection, to claim new hosts, to perpetuate the ancient cycle of decay and rebirth. He reached a high exposed branch, swaying precariously in the chilling wind, the forest floor a dizzying, irrelevant distance below. He clung there, his fungal body trembling with a cold, alien purpose, his vacant, milky eyes staring out blindly at the darkening, indifferent woods, no longer seeing the fading beauty of the forest, but only the vast, unseen potential for propagation, for fungal expansion, for silent, inevitable mycelial dominion. And then from his body, from the grotesque fungal growths that now encased and defined him, from the very pores of his pale, stretched, fungal skin, a fine, pale, living mist began to erupt, slowly at first, then in a billowing cloud that enveloped him entirely, obscuring his monstrous shape, blurring the line between fungal growth and forest air. Spores, millions upon countless millions of microscopic, living spores, released into the chilling wind, carried on the tainted autumn breeze, drifting silently down to the darkening, indifferent forest, settling on fallen leaves, on rough bark, on the damp, receptive earth below, seeking new hosts, new victims, new vessels of mycelial veil, perpetuating the ancient, unstoppable cycle. Elias, or what had once been Elias, remained perched high in the swaying branches, a grotesque, fungal effigy silhouetted against the dying light, a silent, chilling monument to transformation, to irreversible loss, to the terrifying, indifferent power of nature to consume and repurpose, to the bleak, fungal truth that in the ancient, uncaring heart of the wilderness, humanity is but a fleeting, fragile bloom, easily overtaken, easily replaced, easily consumed. And the forest, ancient and silent, breathed in the spores and waited patiently, inevitably, for the next host to stumble unknowing into its silent, fungal embrace. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and unwind at a secluded lake cabin my friends had rented. The sun hung high in the sky as we drove through the winding roads, laughter filling the car. I had no idea that beneath the glassy surface of the lake lay horrors waiting to awaken. As we arrived, the cabin looked quaint, nestled among towering pines. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a refreshing change from the city smog. We unpacked and settled in, excitement buzzing in the air. That evening, we gathered around a fire pit, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows under a blanket of stars. As darkness fell, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, its surface smooth and inviting, but something about it felt off, a deep, unsettling chill that made me shiver. "Let's go swimming," my friend Jake suggested, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Are you crazy?" I replied, glancing at the dark waters. "It's freezing." "Come on, live a little," he laughed, jumping into the water with a splash. The others followed, their joyous shouts echoing across the lake. I hesitated, but the thrill of the moment pulled me in. I couldn't let fear hold me back. I took a deep breath and plunged into the icy water. The shock was jarring, but I quickly adapted, swimming toward my friends. We splashed and joked, the cold forgotten in our laughter, but the feeling of unease lingered at the back of my mind. Then I noticed it, a shadow beneath the surface. It darted quickly just out of sight, and my heart raced. I called out, "Did you guys see that?" My voice tinged with panic. "What?" Jake laughed, splashing me playfully. "You're imagining things." "No, really. I saw something." I insisted, scanning the darkness below. But their laughter drowned out my concerns, and I reluctantly pushed it aside, trying to enjoy the moment. As the night wore on, we climbed out of the water, shivering and exhilarated. We gathered around the fire, the warmth seeping into our bones. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the depth of the lake. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, I found myself unable to close my eyes. The lake whispered to me, beckoning me closer. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I slipped outside, drawn to the water's edge. The moonlight danced on the surface, but beneath it, the darkness seemed alive. "Just a quick look," I murmured to myself, kneeling at the water's edge. I peered into the depths, heart pounding, when suddenly I saw it again, a figure moving just below the surface. It was larger than I had imagined, and its shape twisted and turned like a serpent. Fear gripped me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. I turned to run back to the cabin when I heard it. A soft, melodic voice calling from the depths. "Come to me." I froze, the voice wrapping around me like a tendril. I whispered, "What do you want?" My voice trembling. The water rippled, and the figure rose close to the surface, revealing a face, pale and haunting, with eyes that seemed to pull me in. "Help me," it pleaded, the voice echoing in my mind. I'm trapped beneath the surface. Panic surged through me, but an inexplicable urge tugged at my heart. "I can't help you," I stammered, backing away. The figure's expression darkened, and the surface of the water began to churn violently. "Please, you must," it cried, the water swirling into a tempest. I felt a pull, as if the lake itself was reaching for me, its icy fingers grasping at my ankles. "You're the only one." I shouted, "No!" fighting against a force that threatened to drag me under. I turned to run, but the lake roared in anger, waves crashing against the shore. The shadows beneath the surface writhed, and I realized I was not the first to hear the call. I sprinted back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, but the whispers followed me. "Help us! Help us!" They echoed in my mind, a chorus of despair that chilled my soul. I burst through the door, waking my friends with a start. Jake asked, "What's wrong?" bleary-eyed and confused. I gasped, breathless. "Something's in the lake." "I saw it. We need to leave." "Calm down," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "It's just your imagination." "No, I'm serious. There's something beneath the surface." I insisted, desperation clawing at my throat, but their laughter only deepened my fear, and I realized that I was utterly alone in this. As the night wore on, I could hear the whispers growing louder, the water thrumming with energy. I lay awake, fear gnawing at my insides, contemplating my next move. I was certain now that we were not safe. Whatever lurked beneath the lake wanted something from me. The following morning, I decided to confront my fears. I gathered my courage, and with a heavy heart, I convinced Jake and the others to join me for a swim. We need to see what's really down there, I urged, trying to mask my terror. Reluctantly, they agreed, and we waded into the water. As we swam out toward the center of the lake, the feeling of dread intensified, and the surface seemed to ripple with anticipation. I could feel the dark presence lurking, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the water beneath us began to churn violently, and the shadows surged upward, forming a massive shape that broke the surface. It was a grotesque creature, its body a twisted mass of limbs and eyes, glistening in the sunlight. I screamed, panic electrifying my body. Swim back. I shouted, but the lake roared in fury, the waves crashing over us. The creature lunged forward, its maw opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I felt a surge of terror, and instinct kicked in. I swam for my life. Chaos erupted as my friend screamed, flailing in the water. I glanced back, seeing the creature devouring one of them, its cries abruptly silenced. My heart shattered, but I couldn't look back. I fought against the waves, my lungs burning, desperation fueling my strokes. I reached the shore, collapsing onto sand, gasping for air. I turned back to the lake, the creature now submerged, its presence lingering beneath the surface like a dark omen. I had escaped, but at what cost? As the sun began to set, casting a crimson hue across the lake, I realized the truth. The voices would never leave me. The darkness beneath the surface would always lurk, waiting for the next moment of weakness to claim its next victim. And so, I fled the cabin, leaving behind the echoes of laughter and the memories of my friends. But the whispers of the lake would forever haunt my dreams, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie beneath, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to answer their call. Blackwood National Park. Even the name sounds old, doesn't it? Like something ripped from the pages of Grimm's fairy tale, a whispered warning in a children's story. And the woods, they live up to the name and to the whispers. Ancient trees, thicker than any you've ever seen, their bark like wrinkled skin, their branches reaching like skeletal, grasping fingers across trails that have been here for who knows how long. Centuries, maybe, before the park, before the rangers, before the roads that carved the wilderness, even before the small, isolated town nestled nervously on the very edge of the woods, clinging to the fringes of civilization. These woods, they were here first. They remember things we've forgotten, things we were never meant to know, things that sleep beneath the soil and stir in the shadows and whisper on the wind. I'm Ranger Sarah Jenkins. Been working in Blackwood for 10 years now. A decade spent walking these ancient trails, breathing this cold, wild air, listening to the rustling secrets of the leaves. Love the woods. Yes, in a way that borders on reverence, on something almost primal. Respect them deeply, instinctively. Feel at home here, in a way I never have anywhere else. A sense of belonging in the heart of the wild. But I'm a ranger, first and foremost, a scientist, a woman of logic and reason, trained to observe, to analyze, to explain the natural world through the lens of empirical evidence. I believe in facts, in biology, in ecology, in what I can see and touch and measure, in the tangible reality of the forest around me. Folklore, local legends, ghost stories whispered around dying campfires, tales of creatures that lurk in the darkness, and ancient pacts made in forgotten times, charming maybe in a quaint, rustic sort of way, entertaining sometimes around a crackling fire on a cold night, but not real, not to be taken seriously by a rational mind, not by me. Blackwood National Park. The locals, they call it tainted ground. Whisper stories about it. Old wives' tales and campfire spookings about things that walk in the deep woods, things best left undisturbed. Goat men, they call them sometimes, or worse names, names swallowed by the wind and the rustling leaves, names that linger in the air like a cold breath on the back of your neck. Folklore, of course. Superstition. But even rangers, even those of us who pride ourselves on reason and science, can't entirely shake off the feeling, the weight of those old stories, especially when you're alone in the woods at dusk, and the shadows start to lengthen into grasping claws, and the trees begin to whisper secrets you don't want to hear, secrets carried on the wind from the heart of the ancient woods. The old families, the ones who've lived here for generations, their roots tangled as deep as the ancient trees themselves, their bloodlines intertwined with the very soil of Blackwood. They don't just whisper the stories, they believe them. They live by them, guided by ancient wisdom and ingrained fear. They fear them, these woods, these creatures, these packs. And their fear is contagious, a creeping, insidious thing. It seeps into the very soil of Blackwood, clinging to the bark of the trees like moss, riding on the wind like a tainted scent, whispering in the silence like a forgotten language. Today, I'm on routine patrol in the western sector of the park, a less traveled area, deeper in the woods, further from the marked trails, closer to the old, overgrown park boundary line, a line that the locals say is more than just a park boundary, a line that separates worlds. Checking for trail erosion after the recent autumn rains that have soaked the forest floor and turned the fallen leaves to a slick, treacherous carpet, making sure the old logging roads, relics of a bygone era, are still passable for emergency vehicles. Should the unthinkable happen, just routine maintenance. The mundane tasks that keep the wild at bay, that keep the park safe, that keep the darkness contained. But this part of the park, it feels profoundly different, older than time itself, quieter than any silence I've ever known, more intense in its stillness, in its ancient presence, in its unspoken secrets. The trees are larger here, impossibly tall, their trunks thicker than ancient redwoods, their branches more twisted and gnarled, reaching for the sky like supplicating arms, their shadows darker and deeper, swallowing the sunlight, creating pockets of impenetrable gloom even in the midday sun. The air is colder here, even in the crisp autumn sunshine, carrying a damp, bone-chilling chill that feels ancient, a cold that seeps into your marrow, that freezes your blood, that speaks of graves of forgotten things. The forest sounds are muted, almost hushed, as if the woods themselves are listening, waiting, holding their breath, anticipating something unseen, something unknown, something coming. And there's a stillness here, a profound, unsettling stillness that goes far beyond natural quiet, beyond the peaceful silence of the wilderness. A stillness that feels intentional, deliberate, aware. A stillness that feels watched, judged, measured. I'm following an old, overgrown logging road, barely more than a deer trail now, a faint scar on the ancient landscape, pushing through claustrophobic thickets of ferns that brush against my legs like cold, spectral fingers and fallen leaves that crunch underfoot with unnatural loudness. The oppressive silence broken only by the heavy crunch of my boots on the damp forest floor, each step echoing too loudly in the unnatural stillness. The occasional sharp snap of a twig underfoot, like a bone breaking in the silence. The distant, mournful call of a lone crow echoing to the towering trees. A lonely, desolate sound in the vast, expectant stillness. A sound that speaks of loss and warning, and something ancient and wrong in the heart of the woods. And then, through the trees, through the shadows, through the oppressive silence, I see it, just off the overgrown trail, almost completely hidden in a tangled mass of thorny vines and moss-covered, lichen-encrusted rocks, nestled at the base of an ancient, gnarled oak. Something out of place in the natural world. Something man-made, yet impossibly old, impossibly ancient. Something wrong. Something calling to me. I push through the dense, thorny undergrowth, ignoring the sharp scratches on my hands and face, drawn by a sudden, inexplicable, almost compulsive curiosity, a feeling that this thing is not just important, but vital, that it needs to be investigated, not just observed, but touched, understood, that it's far more than just another piece of forgotten debris, another discarded relic of the park's long and shadowed history, but something significant, something powerful, something dangerous. And as I get closer, pushing aside the clinging vines, brushing away the obscuring moss, the shape resolves itself in the shadows, becomes clearer in the dim light filtering through the dense canopy, takes on a definite, unsettling primordial form. It's a marker, yes, undeniably a marker, standing sentinel in the heart of the woods, a boundary marker, but not like any park boundary marker I've ever seen in my 10 years of patrolling Blackwood. Not plastic, not metal, not modern, not human in its design or its intent. This is stone. Living stone, it seems almost organic in its texture and form. Rough-hewn, yes, but with an unnatural precision, like shaped by forces beyond human comprehension. Moss-covered, yes, but the moss itself is thick, black-green, almost pulsating with an unseen energy, like a living organism clinging to the ancient stone. Ancient-looking? No, ancient, primordial, from a time, before memory, before humanity itself, standing about waist-high, thick and solid, rooted deep in the earth, almost grown from the forest floor itself, an organic extension of the ancient woods, a silent, watchful sentinel in the heart of the wilderness, and carved into the face of the stone, almost completely obscured by the thick, pulsating moss and the creeping, lichen-encrusted surface, are symbols, not letters, not numbers, not runes, not glyphs, not anything I recognize from any human language, any known alphabet, any recorded history. Twisted lines that writhe and coil like living snakes, sharp angles that pierce the eye and the mind, circles and spirals that seem to draw you in, to hypnotize you, to steal your will, shapes that feel unsettlingly, disturbingly familiar, like echoes of something primal buried deep within the human psyche, something forgotten, something repressed, something otherworldly, something wrong. I circle the ancient stone marker slowly, cautiously, my heart pounding against my ribs with frantic, uneven rhythm, a cold prickle of unease no longer just crawling, but surging up my spine, a feeling that I've stumbled onto something not just significant, but forbidden, something I should not be seeing, should not be touching, should not even be near. Something dangerous beyond human comprehension. The air around the ancient marker feels palpably colder, heavier than the already chilled autumn air, pressing against my skin like an icy hand, charged with a strange, almost visible energy, a silent, humming vibration that makes the hairs on my arms stand on end, that whispers of forgotten rituals and ancient unknowable things, that speaks of power and dread and something ancient and wrong. The forest sounds, already muted, are now completely, utterly gone, swallowed by an absolute unnatural, predatory silence that presses in on me from all sides, stealing my breath, stealing my thoughts, leaving my mind blank, my senses overwhelmed, my body trembling with a primal fear I cannot name, cannot rationalize, cannot control, leaving only to faint, unsettling hum in the air, now rhythmic, insistent, like a slow, ancient, angry heartbeat and a frantic, terrified pounding of my own, hard in my ears, a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching silence. And then in the suffocating stillness, in the oppressive silence, in the chilling, ancient air, I remember the stories, the local legends, the whispered warnings of the old families, the hushed tones, the averted eyes, the ingrained fear, the warnings about the old ways, about respecting the balance, about leaving certain places in the woods untouched, unmarked, unviolated, places marked by stones, boundary stones, ancient boundary stones, markers not of park boundaries, not of property lines, not of anything human or rational, but of something else entirely, markers of pacts, markers of limits, markers of danger, markers of the forbidden. The stories, they surge back into my mind now, unbidden, unwelcome, insistent, overwhelming, no longer just whispers, but shouts in the silence of my thoughts, rising from the forgotten depth of my memory, fragments of overheard conversations, snippets of local lore, warnings dismissed as superstition, as quaint local nonsense, now coalescing into a terrifying, undeniable truth. Whispers from old-timers at town meetings, averted glances and hushed tones in the local diner, fragments of forgotten folklore unearthed from dusty library books, all converging, all screaming the same terrifying message. These woods are not just woods. These woods are different, fundamentally, irrevocably different, older than time, deeper than darkness, tainted by something ancient and unclean. Stories about a time, before humanity claimed dominion over the earth, when the woods weren't just woods, but something more, something alive in a way we can no longer comprehend. Stories about creatures that dwelled in the deepest, most untouched parts of the forest, creatures that weren't animal, weren't human, but something in between, something otherworldly, something ancient. Stories about pacts made with these creatures, ancient, forgotten agreements forged in blood and shadow, pacts to keep the balance between worlds, to respect the old ways, to leave certain areas of the woods sacred, forbidden, untouched by human hands. Stories about boundary markers, stones like this one, placed long ago by hands not human, by forces not natural, to delineate the borders between the fragile, fleeting human world and their world, the ancient, primal, hungry world of the wild. Stories about consequences for those foolish enough to disrespect the pact, for those arrogant enough to cross the boundary, for those reckless enough to disturb the balance between worlds, to awaken something that should remain sleeping. Stories about a creature, a guardian of the boundary, an enforcer of the pact, a punisher of transgressors, a being of fur and shadow and cloven hooves and ancient malice, that protects the boundary with a terrifying ferocity, that emerges from the deepest, darkest heart of the woods to claim those who trespass, to drag them into the shadows, to make them pay the ultimate price for their arrogance, their disrespect, their transgression. Stories about a goat man, a creature of nightmare and folklore and ancient primal terror, a creature that waits for those who dare to cross the line. Superstition, nonsense, folklore, just stories whispered in the dark to frighten children and keep foolish hikers on the marked trails. Just local legends, quaint and harmless, nothing more than echoes of forgotten past, right? There's no such thing as pacts with ancient creatures. There's no such thing as guardians of the wild. There's no such thing as goat men. It's just a stone, an old, moss-covered stone marker. Probably just an old property line marker from before the park was established, overgrown and forgotten by time. Nothing more than a geological curiosity, a historical artifact, a piece of inanimate rock in the middle of the woods. Nothing to be afraid of, nothing to respect beyond its historical significance, nothing to fear, right? But the stories, they cling to my mind like shadows, refusing to be dismissed, refusing to be silenced, no longer just whispers, but screams in the silence of my thoughts, persistent, overwhelming, casting a long, icy shadow over my carefully constructed wall of rational thought, whispering insidious doubts in the oppressive silence of the woods, planting seeds of primal terror in the fertile ground of my deepest instincts. And the stone, it feels undeniably different. It radiates not just coldness, but malevolence. It emanates not just age, but ancient power. It exudes not just presence, but something else, something darker, something unclean, tainted, wrong in a way that defies logic and reason, and everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And the silence, it's not just natural forest silence, peaceful and calming. It's a silence that listens with an ancient, predatory awareness. A silence that waits with an unnerving patience. A silence that judges with an ancient, unforgiving malice. And the air, it's colder now, much colder, biting at my exposed skin like frost, seeping into my clothes like a chilling mist, penetrating to the very core of my being, carrying not just the ancient chill of the woods, but a new, tainted coldness, a cold that speaks of graves and forgotten things and something ancient and wrong stirring the darkness, carrying that unsettling hum, that ancient rhythmic resonance, that feeling of wrongness, contamination, violation. And the woods themselves, they feel different too, transformed in an instant from a familiar, comforting wilderness into something alien and hostile and aware. No longer just woods, trees and undergrowth and trails and shadows and sunlight filtering through the leaves, but something else, something awakened, something listening with every rustle of leaf, every snap of twig, every beat of my terrified heart, something watching from every shadow, every tree trunk, every patch of deepening gloom, something waiting with an ancient, predatory patience for a sign, for a signal, for a transgression, for a victim. And they know, they sense it, they feel it, they understand it. They know that the boundary has been crossed, that the line has been violated, that the pact has been broken, that the balance has been irrevocably disturbed. And they respond with a silence that screams, with a coldness that chills the soul, with a scent that taints the air, with a presence that darkens the woods, and with a promise of retribution, inevitable retribution. But I am a ranger. I am not a child to be frightened by shadows and whispers and old wives' tales. I am not going to let superstition dictate my patrol, to turn me back from my duty, to paralyze me with irrational fear. I have a job to do, a part to protect, a boundary line to check, a responsibility to uphold. And this is just a stone, just a marker, just an obstacle in my path, just in my way. And the boundary line, according to my official park map, the line I am sworn patrol, the line I am duty-bound protect, it runs directly through this location, just beyond this ancient marker, just a few yards further into the deepening woods, into the encroaching shadows, into the heart of the forbidden zone. I need to check it. I must check it. I have to check it. I need to make sure it's still clearly marked, still properly maintained, still serving its purpose, whatever that purpose may be. I need to cross the boundary, just for a moment, just a step or two, just to verify the marker on the other side, to ensure the integrity of the park boundary, to fulfill my sworn duty. Just routine, just my job, just necessary, just no choice. I take a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force down the rising tide of icy, primal fear that threatens to drown my reason, trying desperately to ignore the insistent, screaming whispers of folklore and ancient warnings echoing in my mind, trying to rationalize away the overwhelming, paralyzing sense of dread that threatens to root me to the spot, to steal my will, to shatter my resolve. It's just a stone, just woods, just routine, just my job, just duty. I force my leaden legs to move, take a hesitant step forward, then another, deliberately, resolutely, placing my heavy, trembling boot firmly on the cold, moss-covered earth, right beside the ancient, forbidden stone marker, steeling myself against the icy touch of the ancient stone, against the suffocating weight of the oppressive silence, against the primal scream of warning in my soul. And then, I take the final, irreversible step. I step over it. I cross the boundary. I trespass into the forbidden zone. I violate the ancient pact. I ignore the whispered warnings of generations. I disturb the balance between worlds. I enter the place that is untouched, forbidden, sacred, tainted. And as my boot crosses the invisible yet undeniably real line, as I step beyond the ancient, silent sentinel, as I trespass into the heart of forbidden space, into the territory of the unseen and the unknown, into the realm of ancient power and primal dread, the oppressive silence breaks. Not with a sudden, violent crash, not with thunderous bang, not with any dramatic, overt sound of supernatural fury, but subtly, insidiously, unnervingly, in a way that is far more terrifying than any overt display of power. The oppressive, expectant silence shifts. It deepens, yes, becomes even more profound, more absolute, more suffocating, pressing it on me from all sides like a physical weight, stealing my breath, stealing my will, stealing my very soul. But it changes in its very essence, in its fundamental nature. It takes on a new, terrifying quality, a quality of awareness, as if the silence itself is now sentient, listening, watching, judging, a quality of expectation, as if the silence is holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to occur, a quality of malice, as if the silence itself is now hostile, predatory, hungry, and the unsettling hum, that ancient rhythmic resonance, it changes too, subtly yet profoundly. It deepens, yes, becomes lower, more resonant, more ancient, vibrating in the very bones of the earth, echoing from the heart of the woods, resonating with a power that chills me to the core. But it changes rhythm, no longer just a hum, no longer just a resonance. It quickens, slightly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, irrevocably it pulses. Like a heartbeat, yes, but not a human heartbeat, not an animal heartbeat, but something else entirely. Slow, heavy, ancient, malevolent, and angry, pulsing with ancient rage, with primal fury, with an intent that is not just hostile, but predatory, vengeful, unstoppable. And the air, it changes again, subtly yet irrevocably transformed. It becomes colder still, biting at my skin with an unnatural frost that burns like fire, seeping into my clothes like a shroud, penetrating to the very marrow of my bones, freezing my blood in my veins, carrying not just the ancient chill of the woods, but a new, tainted, unclean coldness, a cold that speaks of graves and forgotten things, an ancient, malevolent power stirring in the darkness, carrying that unsettling hum, that ancient, rhythmic, angry resonance, that feeling of wrongness, contamination, violation, now amplified, intensified, overwhelming. And the woods themselves, they change to subtly, imperceptibly, yet undeniably, irrevocably transformed. They shift, they stir, they awaken from their ancient slumber, no longer just trees and undergrowth and shadows and sunlight, but something else entirely, something aware, something sentient, something hostile. They listen with every rustle of leaf, every snap of twig, every beat of my terrified heart, amplified 1,000-fold in the oppressive silence. They watch from every shadow, every tree trunk, every patch of deepening gloom, their unseen eyes burning with ancient malice. They wait with an ancient, predatory patience for the inevitable consequence, for the promised retribution, for the price to be paid for transgression. And they know, they sense my presence, my transgression, my fear. They feel the disturbance in the balance, the violation of the pact, the breaking of the ancient law. They understand with an ancient, primal knowing that transcends human comprehension. And they respond with a silence that screams of ancient malice, with a coldness that chills the very soul, with a scent that taints the air with primal dread, with a presence that darkens the woods and blots out the sun, and with a promise of retribution, inevitable, unstoppable, ancient retribution. And that retribution is coming. Immediately, as if summoned by my transgression, as if unleashed by the breaking of the ancient pact. I feel it, not just a profound change in the air, the silence, the woods themselves, the oppressive weight of ancient malice pressing down on me from all sides, but something internal, visceral, primal, a shift deep within my very being, a tremor in the core of my soul, a violation of my inner self. A prickling sensation erupts across my skin, like unseen thorns tearing my flesh, a tightening in my chest that steals my breath and crushes my lungs, a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline that floods my system like ice water, making my heart hammer against my ribs with frantic, terrified urgency, my breath catching ragged, panic gasps, my senses scream in primal, instinctive alarm, every nerve ending firing with raw, untamed fear. It's not just fear, not just human terror, not just rational apprehension. It's something deeper, more ancient, more fundamental. Something primal, instinctive, atavistic. A terror that echoes from the dawn of humanity. From a time when humans were prey and the woods were filled with gods and monsters and ancient unknowable things. A feeling that I have done something not just wrong, not just foolish, not just dangerous, but something forbidden, irreversible, catastrophic. Something unforgivable. A feeling that I am no longer just observed, no longer just watched, no longer just judged, but something far worse. A feeling that I am being claimed, that I am being hunted, that I am being consumed, and that the woods themselves, the ancient, sentient, angry woods, are no longer just woods, but something else entirely, something alive, something hostile, something predatory, something inhuman, and they are coming for me. And then cutting to the oppressive, predatory silence, overriding the deafening pounding of my heart, the rasping, panic gasps of my breath, the frantic, silent screams of my terror-stricken soul. I hear it, faintly, distantly at first, but rapidly growing closer, louder, more insistent, carried on a chilling, tainted breeze, echoing with unnatural resonance through the suddenly hostile silence of the ancient woods. A sound that makes the blood in my veins turn to solid, glacial ice, that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end like frozen needles, that makes the primal fear in my gut clench into a knot of absolute, paralyzing terror, a terror that steals my breath, steals my will, steals my very soul, a sound that is unnatural, twisted, wrong in its very essence, a sound that is coming closer with every agonizing heartbeat, with every stolen breath, with every frantic, silent scream, a sound that is hunting me through the darkening woods, tracking me through the oppressive silence, pursuing me with an ancient, relentless, inevitable purpose, a sound that promises pain, violation, transformation, and something far, far worse than mere death. Bleeding. A goat bleeding, yes, undeniably, unmistakably a goat bleeding. But not just a goat bleeding, not the bleeding of any earthly animal, but something twisted, mocking, inhuman in its resonance, a sound that echoes with unnatural clarity through the ancient trees, a bleating that grates on the soul, that chills the blood, that speaks of mockery and malice and ancient, unknowable evil, a sound that promises not just death but damnation. Bleating, louder now, closer now, echoing through the woods like a death knell, carried on a tainted wind, promising retribution, promising punishment, promising the goat man coming closer with terrifying speed, and with it inseparable from it, intertwined with it, amplified by it, a new sound, a heavier sound, a more rhythmic sound, a more menacing sound, a sound of something moving through the undergrowth with deliberate, measured steps, no longer distant, no longer faint, no longer unseen, but approaching rapidly, relentlessly, unstoppably. Not animal footsteps, not human footsteps, but something in between, something otherworldly, something ancient, something wrong, something walking, upright, yes, but with an unnatural gait, a loping, predatory stride that speaks of inhuman power and ancient malice. Something hunting me through the darkness, tracking me through the silence, pursuing me with an ancient, inevitable hunger. Something inevitable, something waiting, just beyond the trees that now writhe and twist like living nightmares. Just beyond the deepening shadows that claw at the edges of my vision. Just beyond the ancient boundary marker that I so foolishly, so arrogantly, so fatally crossed. Waiting for me because I crossed the line, because I broke the pact, because I disturbed the balance, because I ignored the warnings, because I dismissed the folklore, because I dared to trespass in the forbidden realm. And because the woods remember, and the woods punish with an ancient, unforgiving wrath. And the woods are coming for me, in the form of a bleating in the woods, in the form of approaching hooves on the forest floor, in the form of something ancient and unclean and utterly, irrevocably inevitable, in the form of the goat man. And there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no escape from the encroaching darkness, from the suffocating silence, from the deafening bleating, from the approaching hooves, from the ancient, predatory power that is now unleashed and hunting me through the heart of Blackwood National Park, only to wait and listen and watch and tremble as the bleating echoes louder, closer, more twisted, more mocking, as the hooves crunch closer, faster, more relentlessly, more inhumanly, as the ancient, rhythmic hum pulses deafeningly, menacingly, angrily, predatorily, as the musky, tainted scent intensifies, suffocates, consumes, and as it approaches from the heart of the ancient, awakened, hostile woods, something inevitable, something waiting just beyond the trees, waiting to claim me, waiting to punish me, waiting for me.